Welcome to Safe on Deck. Episode 22 is part 1 of my interview with Royal Air Force Squadron Leader Bruce Macdonald. Bruce joined the Air Force in 1980 on an RAF Cadetship to study aeronautical engineering. And after training on the Bulldog, the Jet Provost, and the Hawk, he was selected to fly the Tornado GR1, a variable sweep wing, multi-role combat aircraft. Bruce flew his first ever combat sortie on Night 1 of Operation Desert Storm, attacking Tallil Airfield in southern Iraq at 100 feet and 600 knots, in order to employ the JP-233 low-altitude airfield denial system. Following completion of his first operational posting in Germany, Bruce returned to the United Kingdom to fly the Hawk, instructing student pilots on low-level navigation, ground attack, fighter maneuver, and weapons delivery sorties. Next, Bruce returned to the Tornado, where he served as an instructor pilot on the GR1 Weapons Conversion Unit, before being recruited to train as a test pilot. Following graduation from the Empire Test Pilot School, Bruce conducted a multitude of systems research and developmental flight test projects on the Tornado GR1 and the Jaguar GR3, all while continuing to fly the Hawk and the Tucano. Bruce was then selected for a highly coveted exchange tour with the U.S. Air Force on the 40th Flight Test Squadron at Eglin Air Force Base, where he flew the F-16 Viper and the C-130 Hercules on weapons delivery and certification test sorties. Following a 20-plus year career in the Royal Air Force, Bruce transitioned to the airlines, where he flew the Boeing 717 and the Boeing 737 for U.S. domestic air carriers for over 10 years. These days, Bruce is an Airbus experimental test pilot based in Mobile, Alabama, where he performs production and customer acceptance test flights on the A220 and A320 airliners. Thus far, his career at Airbus has included flight test time in the A220, A320, A330, A340, A350, A380, the A400M Atlas, and the A330 Beluga-XL. Bruce is a prolific general aviation pilot who currently owns and operates a Vans RV4. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, Episode 22, Part 1, with Squadron Leader Bruce Macdonald. Enjoy. Bruce, it's a rainy Tuesday afternoon here in beautiful Pensacola. Thanks so very much for taking the time to do this, working with your busy schedule at Airbus. Start these all the same way, so I'll start yours the same way as well. Where were you born?
I was born in a satellite town to the southeast of the large city of Glasgow, Scotland, which, and I grew up there initially. Our family moved around a little bit. When I was 9 years old, we moved out to South Africa. Had a different experience out there. But even by the 9 years old, I'd kind of got the bug for flying. Airplanes and aviation. I had no real way to get hold of it, but I've still got books on my shelf that I was given as a kid for Christmas presents. That I know I was only 7 or 8 years old, so they must have known that I was already into airplanes in a big way.
Wow, that's really cool. Was that you mentioned it was at home, but did that follow you in South Africa, or?
Well,
I know there's a very big aviation community there is the reason I asked.
Right. Well, I kind of lost out a little bit. I had nobody in the family to take me flying. I didn't have any relatives, even distant relatives who were pilots or anybody in the military. So I obviously liked airplanes. Once in a while I would get taken to the city airport in the days when there was like a viewing gallery on the top deck and you could go and watch the airline. Before the days of gates, people would walk out to the airplanes and up the steps and things. So I can remember a couple of times getting taken out there. But when I was in South Africa, I didn't have much opportunity as much as I would have done if I'd stayed in the UK, because when I was comparing notes with some of my guys I joined the RAF with, they had done things like what they called the Air Training Corps, which is like air cadets. You wear a uniform, weekly meetings, you go to visits to RAF stations, and you get some air experience flights. I think they used the Chipmunk, de Havilland Chipmunk in those days for that kind of thing. Well, they didn't have the equivalent in South Africa, so I missed out on that. And the other thing that the RAF had was something called a flying scholarship, which you applied when you're about 16. And basically the RAF, they give you the aptitude test for pilot and whatnot. They were hoping that you would join, but there was no obligation. And they basically paid for your private. They paid for about 35 hours of flying instruction. So the 5 or 10, you usually scrape together the money. So you had to apply when you're 16, and you would typically do it in the summer vacation between your junior and senior year of high school. And I used those Those are the American terms. We don't call them junior or, you know. But so I didn't come back from South Africa till I was 16 and a half. I'd missed that little window as well. So, but nonetheless, I was back in the UK, and now I could apply to the RAF.
Why the RAF? Why the Air Force?
Well, really, how I'd kept my passion for airplanes. I read books. I had read all those biographies of World War II and World War I RAF pilots, and so it was military flying that appealed to me. But really, also, I had other books about civilian flying too. But it had to be, because I saw what those military guys did with their airplanes. They didn't just fly them from A to B. When they were. In today's world, we would say they were a weapon system. But, as a kid, you just thought, that's cool. They're fighting their airplanes. And I just wanted to join the RAF.
So what was your way into the RAF?
When, of course, I was about 17, I was applying to various universities in England. I realized by then I hated writing essays. I was better at the maths and the sciences, so I was thinking, engineering will be something that I could probably do as a good backup if I can't get a pilot slot. I applied to do an aeronautical engineering degree. There's only about half a dozen universities in England that actually offer that, so I applied to them all, and I was lucky enough to get one. At the same time, I was applying to for my university stuff when I was 18. I also applied to the RAF. One of the methods of entry into the RAF in the pilot program would be what they called an RAF cadetship, really a sponsorship. So they would pay for all your tuition for your university. You would actually have a commission as an acting pilot officer, that's an 01 rank, as an acting in the reserves kind of thing. And you had a commitment afterwards, which was what I wanted. I wanted to be in long term. And the best bit about it was, while you were at university, now you're not going to a military academy. This is a pure civilian university. But they had these organizations called University Air Squadrons, which were to give the ghost guys on that program some flying. So weekends or afternoons after lectures, if you get time off, you went out to the airfield. And this was staffed by full-time active duty RAF instructors. We had about 5 or 6 instructors, about the same number of airplanes, and you would get flying instruction. And it was termed elementary flying instruction, i.e. before basic. I don't know if that really exists over here, but it was in the Bulldog aircraft, the Scottish Aviation Bulldog, which I'll describe for the listeners a little bit. All metal, 2 side-by-side, a trainer built in Prestwick, Scotland. American engine, an IO360 in there, obviously aerobatic, so it had a big bubble canopy, and it had all the military specs, like the canopy had to be jettisonable so that you could bail out. And the syllabus was a standard basic military stuff. After you learned your circuits and your first solo and all that, you were doing aerobatics, installing and spinning and stuff. A really sweet airplane. It was quite roomy by civilian GA standards, I think, because they knew you were going to have military harnesses and life jackets and helmets on, so quite roomy. The controls were really nice and precise. If it had an Achilles heel, it would probably be spinning. That was very much part of the syllabus, but they discovered it had a spin mode, which they described in the manuals as a high rotation spin. And so once in a while, one of these planes would, you'd be doing your spin exercise, and you'd be sitting there trying to recover with the anti-spin controls or recovery controls, and this thing would just wind up and just go down, down, down. And sometimes you just have to wait out, another half a dozen turns, and it might pop out. But over the years, they lost half a dozen planes when they, eventually got down to bailout altitude, and that's it. Out we go. So I could see where the horizontal tail was, there was big strakes that blended into the fuselage. They'd obviously try to fix this somewhat, but not completely. But overall, I look back on the Bulldog, a sweet little plane. The years I flew, totally VFR instruments. It had the 6-pack of instruments, a suction-driven and artificial horizon, VHF and an HF radio. Old technology. Behind the pilot seat, which in the civilian version would probably have been a back seat, was this enormous, heavy crystal radio set, the size of a suitcase, basically, that gave you your UHF channels on 12 channels only, click, 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 because of crystals. But there was no navigation aids at all. It was just, think British weather. We would get airborne sometimes. Where we did our flying training, one of the RAF's last grass airfield operational stations. So grass runways, it had a control tower, but no radar on the field. So sometimes, and we did, if it was like a 1,000-foot ceiling, we would get airborne with our instructor, sometimes even solo, punch up through this cloud if it was only 1,000 or 2,000 feet thick, do our aerobatics and stuff, installing, can't see the ground at all, have no VOR, no TACAN, nothing. So how did we know where we were? So we would do like a direction finding transmission. We'd dial up some RAF station or something and say, true bearing, and he would say, your bearing is 210, and you'd get your wax pencil out on your laminated map there, draw a line, then you go to another station, true bearing, and you draw another line, I must be roughly here. Meanwhile, you're drifting downwind. And where we did this training it was a Class G airspace, but roundabout there were big airports and airways and airspace that we didn't want to drift into, obviously. So I can't believe it, we did it so basically. And how do we get back to the field? Well, we would call up our home field and he'd give us a steer, which is, so you'd fly to the overhead till on his display you flipped over 180 degrees. Now you've flown through the overhead. So then you would go out, and there was an approach plate for this. You'd go out on a particular course, maybe descend from 2,000 feet down to 1,000 for like 2 minutes, and then you do a rate one turn to come in, and you would pop out the cloud. It was kind of like a VOR approach, an airfield approach, not a runway approach. But that's how we'd get back in on these kind of cloudy days, which seems strange now.
And what year is this?
I went to university between the years of 1980 and 1984.
Wow. Okay.
Now, actually, later on in the 80s, they gave the Bulldog a little avionic upgrade. They gave it a VOR DME, an ILS, and a transponder, so it could fit in. We would also, for instance, we did a lot of instrument training with no navigation equipment. We would go over to the RAF proper airfields and do like PARs, because obviously it's a top-down, it's a precision approach, radar approach. A top-down or an SRE, surveillance radar approach. Are
there a lot of PARs in the Royal Air Force?
Although the later airplanes I flew with, of course, had ILSs in them.
Sure.
PARs were our bread and butter. We did them all the time.
Even in the jet. I know we're going to jump ahead. Even in the Tornado. Wow.
And those controllers got so good at it. We almost trusted them more than we would, like if the weather's really bad, I want a PAR. I'm not going to shoot an ILS and rely on my own skills.
That's incredible.
And it was a 200-foot decision height, just like a PAR Cat 1. So, they were very good at it. But the RAF, perhaps because they're all, thinking back to the 50s and 60s, they didn't advance as quickly as they should have done. But PARs was the thing.
Wow.
And of course, I got over here, and we had to do PARs for our U.S. currency. The only place we could get them was at a Navy field.
Navy field, yeah, Navy Marine Corps.
So we'd come over to Pensacola and shoot a PAR.
You will see a lot of ASRs in the civilian world, but I've also, and I know recently we're talking in June of 2022, but a lot of there's been controller shortages, and just literally they don't have, I think, the bodies in some cases, and so a lot of civilian fields. When I'm doing training with the students, unable. Okay, no worries, we'll go back to Navy Pensacola, and they get to talk to our Navy controllers who do a wonderful job for us.
Yeah.
So how many hours in the Bulldog? Do you remember ballpark?
Well, I've got my logbook here with me, so in case we run out of details. But I got
nice.
about 170 spread over 4 years. There was a standard military syllabus, but some guys would join this program maybe not in their first year of university. So you just kind of went along with it there was no kind of finishing point. You got training with them, and when you decided you were going to the full-time RAF, you just kind of left and got on with it. So I got probably more than most.
That's what happened next, though, right? You went to the full-time RAF.
One other thing I'd like to tell you about the degree I did. It was a 4-year degree, but it had a 6-month element where you were supposed to go out into industry to get some experience. I guess the university thought it'd be great if when you graduated, you weren't purely academic, you'd done a job, like an intern done a job. So I had my RAF sponsorship. So I actually managed to, therefore I could get a little further afield on RAF transport, and they would give me allowances to stay. So I actually went to Canada at age 20, to Ottawa, to the National Research Council, and where they've got a big hangar full of research airplanes and stuff like that, and basically was a go for the intern for a bunch of test pilots, which kind of, you'll see later in the story, makes you back to full circle, when I got to be a test pilot. But so that, and I mean, when you're 20 and 21 years old and you're just I had maybe 100 hours in the Bulldog by then, so not very experienced, but still very keen. And, they had a couple of, Twin Otters, which I flew in, helicopters, Bell 205 and 206, 205, fly-by-wire with a side stick and all sort of research stuff like that. They had a Bell 47. They had a T6, not your kind, but the kind with the radial engine.
The Harvard,
the Harvard.
The real T6, yeah.
And so flew that a couple of times. What a revelation. The Bulldog, I mentioned, light controls, tiny movements, did our aerobatic maneuver. You did your hammerhead, put rudder in, tiny bit of aileron, peps to stop at the top. You go up in the Harvard, full around, full outside aileron, full forward stick, and big, huge, heavy movements of the stick. What a difference. So, those are from the days when they wanted trainers to be hard to fly because it weeded out the guys who couldn't do it. And they were going to go on to very high performance P-51s and all this kind of thing. So, nowadays we try and seem to design our airplanes to make them really easy to fly. But, they should be. We want the guys to be concentrating on the mission. So that's the reason for it. But boy, if you could fly a Harvard or a Texan, as they even called it in this country, you could fly anything.
Yeah. Do you remember what other airframes they had there?
They had a Beech Expediter, Beech 18 Expediter,
yep,
2 radial engines.
45, right? Yeah, Beech 18, basically.
A couple of flights in there. Yep. I mean, I didn't fly every day. I was there. I was helping the test pilots. I was doing some calculations for them and helping with little sections of their test reports.
I will admit something that might sound silly because you brought it up. My mom worked for the Air Force. She recently retired and doing data analysis and data acquisition at Arnold Air Force Base. It's in Tennessee. It's a small base that most folks haven't heard of. But the reason I mention it is we were having a conversation actually not too long ago on these microphones, and she said something about plotting data, and in just my young dumb brain, I thought, Microsoft Excel, and you pull and she manually plotting data to make a curve, so that the engineers could then do things with that, and it made me feel so silly because how do you
human computers basically?
Yes, that's exactly what it was. That's what you were, I'm assuming.
I was just helping them out with basic stuff like that, speed up their report writing. But they would take me for training flights once in a while. When we were given a plane to fly, and most of them were 2 seats. So
how long was that experience?
I was there for about 5 months. T-33. I got a couple of. Now, when I was a young, all I'd ever flown was Bulldogs to get a couple of rides. And to be accurate, they were the Canadian CT-133 Silver Star.
Correct. Yeah, different engine, I think.
Yes,
a little bit different.
A Rolls-Royce engine, I think.
That's
actually.
Right. Yep. Such a beautiful airplane.
Yes. But me, I was swamped by the experience. I could relate it to nothing, particularly the ejection seat, because there was ones with the handles on the side rather than in between your legs. Anyway.
Not a 00 seat either.
No, a bank seat, definitely.
Yeah, just a cartridge, a mortar shell, basically. Yeah. No, thank you.
So that was a great experience. And then I came back, did my final year of university, and graduated in 1984.
1984. Okay. Mm-hmm. When you graduated, what's the next step in the career?
Right. So I've obviously had the benefit of the RAF paying my tuition for 4 years. Now, got to pay the lady, huh? So, but unlike, say, the ROTC program that people will do in colleges here, where that's really your leadership and your military, awareness training, that if you've done ROTC, I believe, if you join the Air Force, the Navy, you go straight to flight school. I had still to do OCS. Because the University of Squadron was it was a flying club. It's basically a flying and drinking club, if we're totally honest. It was the best social club on campus, to be honest. So I still had to do my officer training, which we use the acronym IOT, Initial Officer Training. It was 18 weeks long at that time. Shortly after, this is the mid-'80s, not many years after I did it, they increased it to 24 weeks, another 6-week module, but not on the end. On the beginning, because we are the generation who grew up climbing trees, kicking soccer balls around, running around. Next generation are on the couch playing their video games. So when they would get to officer training, they're getting huge amounts of leg injuries, ankle injuries, because they weren't physically tough enough. So the RAF basically introduced a 6-week physical training module on the beginning. Now, I'm sure you were getting a lot of the shouted at by drill sergeants kind of thing, but really it was to toughen them up physically, so that there would be reduction in the leg injuries and things.
You mentioned that toughening people up. What was your experience? Was this your first, you mentioned, yes, a flying club, drinking club, but this was your first experience as a member of the military. Was it a shock to the system? Were you ready for it?
Well, any OCS is never like the real Air Force, is it? It's, but I had seen a glimpse of it when I'd been at University Squadron. It was staffed by half a dozen full-time RAF pilots who'd done several tours, that's the kind of, and they kind of made the squadron atmosphere somewhat similar to like an RAF squadron, or certainly an RAF training squadron would be. So I knew that was, what life would be like. I just had to get through the BS of IoT. I'm not explaining that acronym, by the way. So
bull hockey. Yes, indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
So I went through it, and
it's good to hear that in all services, in all countries, apparently it's the same general experience. You press the I believe button, you do a bunch of push-ups. Yeah.
So there was about 120, I suppose, on that intake. It was in 3 6-week modules equaling 18 weeks. Every 6 weeks, another class would start, and you would move from one set of accommodation to the other. It gradually got better, and by the end, because they're teaching you to be an RAF officer and a gentleman, by the end of the course, you're staying in this very grand thing that looks like a palace, and you have a Batman to shine your shoes and bring you a cup of tea in the morning, because this is supposedly what upper class officers do. Although it didn't. Then you go back to flying training, and you're, living in a barracks basically. But there was a taste of what that was like. So I did officer training there. I remember we graduated mid-January, very cold. There was always a big graduation parade. I remember wearing several pairs of long johns under my uniform, because you're out there, for hours, and it was an outdoor parade. And of course, you march up the steps of the college building into the, when you finally graduated. And
everyone else here, I say, an ensign, a second lieutenant. What rank do you graduate as you're joining the Royal Air Force as a student pilot?
Well, you can actually become an officer in the Royal Air Force with only without a degree. That's
really
unusual, I know, for USCers. But if you have got a degree, they give you extra seniority for it. So actually, most guys were graduating as the rank is called a flying officer, which is actually an O2.
Okay.
Because they were getting a few years of now direct entry guys who've come straight at 18. They would be a pilot officer.
Okay, so pilot officer.
The only time I was a pilot officer when I was an acting pilot officer on the University Air Squadron. That acting rank they gave me just during my university years.
Okay.
And you've seen the RAF rank. It's the thin blue stripes on the shoulder.
Absolutely. Yep.
RAF ranks, when the RAF was created in 1918. We're supposed to mirror the Navy, actually. Our enlisted ranks were from the Army, sergeants and corporals and all that kind of thing. Our officer ranks were supposed to mirror the Navy. So we have, and I'm going to use the British way of expressing, lieutenant for lieutenant. And so we have a flight lieutenant equivalent to lieutenant. We have a squadron leader equivalent to a lieutenant commander. We have a wing commander equivalent to commander. Group captain equivalent to captain. So, and then, the Air Commodore, I don't know if you have Commodore in the US.
We do. Yeah, it'd be an 06 job.
So the commissioned ranks were kind of based off the Navy.
Interesting. Nautical tradition, it guides us all.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I graduated from officer training, a quick 2 weeks up in survival school in the north of Scotland before I started flying training.
When you say survival school, if you don't mind, I'll ask, is it... You're talking about...
Survival course. I wasn't becoming an instructor.
Okay.
They were throwing us out on the mountainside with a parachute for
it's cold
for
and dreary, and start a fire and all that. Yeah, exactly. Kill the bunny rabbit.
Yeah. And of course, I graduated in January, so now it's February, and now it's the Scottish Highlands. We were quite lucky. It didn't snow very much, but...
Who were your instructors?
They were... what we call RAF PTIs, physical training instructors, the kind of, who are also kind of outdoors experts in a variety of things. There was RAF runs this survival school up in the mountains. It wasn't as bad as I'm painting. It was a 2-week course. You arrived on Monday, and before you'd done anything, they said, just walk this way, threw you in the back of this army truck, took you out, and dropped you in the dark. You hadn't a clue where you were. And they said, and then they came back and see how you'd survive the next day, give you a bit of instruction. So the first week was all that kind of thing. Okay, starving, hungry, and we got picked up on Friday. The next day, we went skiing for physical training. We went skiing. They had a big, locker full of skis and whatnot they issued, and we went to the Scottish ski resorts for about 3 or 4 days. So really, it was a great fun.
That was not my experience in the mountains of Maine. It's here. So, well, very cool. Okay, so you said 2 weeks for that program.
Yeah, and then there was a couple of our preparatory courses for flying training. We went to the School of Aviation Medicine to go, hypoxia training, and probably now they do centrifuge, but I don't know. We didn't do centrifuge in those days, but lots of lectures about the physiological effects of flying, and as the hypoxia, stuff in the chamber prior to our first getting in a jet for the first time, and then we were ready to go. And I went to the at that time, the RAF ran 3 bases where you could do basic flying training. I went to Cranwell, which was the same place I had done the officer training. It's where the RAF college is. And I flew the jet Provost, which was a very early generation jet. Actually, the prototype was converted from what they called the piston Provost. It used to have a big radial engine, and the company said, I think we can make this airframe work. And they took the piston engine out and put a jet in. So it looked a little boxy like that. It had a very early generation Rolls-Royce Viper engine, which is a turbojet, no bypass duct, no turbofan, so not very good fuel consumption. We had enough fuel for a basic up and away exercise, about an hour, 1.1 if you're doing instruments or aerobatics. But when we did a lot of the low-level navigations, 35 minutes and you're out of gas. It had 2,000 pounds of fuel on it, so it gulped that down pretty quickly. Side-by-side seating, which is unusual for a jet, so more like a T-37, single jet though. And I was lucky because we had the Mark 5s, the T5s at Cranwell. They were pressurized and had a bit more thrust. The earlier Mark 4s and 3s they had up the road at the other bases were unpressurized, and it was they call it variable noise constant speed kind of thing.
Variable noise constant speed. I love it.
That was the jet so I didn't have to fly those old ones. Had Mark IV Martin Baker ejection seats, which are again early generation, pure bang, maybe 3 cartridges. But if you were going to end up with crush vertebrae,
was that something?
Saved your life.
Yeah, was that something that I hate to ask the question that way, but did it happen often? Was there a lot of issues? It's talking again an earlier generation.
I don't remember anybody ejecting during the time I was at Cranwell on my course or in any other. So
it's the way it's supposed to be. You don't want that type of thing happening.
No.
Yeah.
So I did my training there. We lasted, they streamed us about 2/3 of the way through. Streamed us into Group 1, which was what we called fast jets. That included air-to-air fighters plus ground attack fighters. And Group 2 was the multi-engines, the heavies, transports, maritime patrol stuff. And Group 3 was your line of the word.
Helicopters. Yeah.
And for those of us, and I don't know if you felt the same going through your training, the whole program was really designed to create jet pilots, and everything else was like almost considered a washout. You washed out the program. When they had the roll disposal board, they would sometimes give us a heads up in advance. Say, look, we've got to send a couple of guys to helicopters. Any of you guys want to volunteer? And some guys would. My very good friend that I'd been through college and after training with, I thought he was like me. He was on jets, but as soon as he put his hand up right away, I want to go and do this. Well, he got operational much quicker because they gave him. He did like another 4 sorties at Cranwell on like close formation, which is the closest thing maybe to hovering. You can maybe confirm that. And then off he was. He got through much quicker. In fact, he was already a search and rescue pilot on one of the bases I went to for one of my later stages of training. So he was earning his keep already.
What did he fly? Do you remember?
Sea King.
Yeah. What a beautiful machine. Yeah.
He spent half his life in the Falklands though, because by that point the Falklands is over, but we're still maintaining presence down there. Those helicopter guys, he did like 6 months on, 6 months off, and the Falklands is not really the bright lights.
It certainly is not.
No.
Yeah.
So
still an RAF presence down there to this day.
Yeah, and it was it was in the news recently. It's the 40th anniversary, so they were kind of just reviewing the situation. The Argentines are still definitely keen on getting their hands on it.
I'm sure they would like to. Yeah.
But I guess I can stand up. The democracy rules. Every time they have a referendum, the small population of the Falklands wants to.
And they lost. There's a lot of really great books by Sharkey Ward and some of those other folks that Sea Harrier, I think,
very interesting little war, because it's almost because it was a small war. It's manageable to analyze it.
Indeed.
And then there was some glaring omissions of technology that should have been there because they were in the rest of the world, but we didn't have good airborne early warning and things like that. So all these attacks they were sneaking up and things. So
it's a different way to fight a war than, like you said, than anything else that we've seen.
Yeah. So where are we? We're
talking about selection.
We're getting selection.
Yes, absolutely.
So the helicopter guys would do about another 4 flights, and off they'd head to RAF Shawbury to do their training. In those days, it was on the Gazelle. Do you remember that French Gazelle?
I do. Yeah.
Now I think they've moved on to some civilianized. A lot of our training in the RAF now has been contractorized and things. So what I'm telling you is about the RAF 40 years ago. Quite different now, and a lot smaller actually. We've really shrunk down money.
Yeah.
The multi-engine guys, whose options would be things like obviously Hercs and Nimrods, and the tank VC-10s, both in the tanker role and the transport role, the Victor tanker, all those kind of 4-engine things. They did a bit more flying. A lot of it was what we call airways navigation, radio waves navigation kind of stuff.
Instrument heavy, it sounds like.
Yeah. For those of us who stayed on the jet track there, I think we stayed for another 3 or 4 months. We had a lot more formation work, starting to do tactical formation, tail chases, which is. Have you ever do that?
I have, yeah. Tail chase is great fun.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of fun. There's a lot more low-level navigation. which is going to become a theme of what I'm telling you about the way the RAF used to operate then. And I might as well start now, because when you looked at, the RAF looked at what they were faced with. They were planning for the big war in the central region of West Germany, fighting the Russians. Hugely electronic warfare intensive, lots of SAMs, lots of fighters up there. And they thought, we just don't have the resources to suppress all these things. So we're going to have to come up with tactics to get under it, basically. So we had all our jet fleets had such a low altitude philosophy. All our operating philosophy was low altitude. So we started that training, imbibing the students very early on. And so we, before your wings, you're doing solo 250 knot navigation at 300 knots.
At what altitude?
250 feet.
Oh my gosh.
So right from pre-wings, we're talking early days, get the guys used to flying along, and we're not talking GPS navigation. I'm talking, map and eyeballs, of course. So we would on this Group 1, Phase 1, as we called it, we did the low-level navigation. So JetProv is quite a powerful learning tool for that. We started the navigation exercise at 240 knots. But then you watch the world roll by at that speed, and then the next bunch were at 300 knots. The jet had the capable, probably low-level smash would be about 330. So you could do 300 and still have some catch-up. So the fuel didn't last long, but this was good. It was going to be a good intro to what was coming up in advanced training. So I finished with we were 10 on our class for basic training, and probably about 6 or 7 of us, I went to the fighters, to the fast jet base.
We always tell our students, it's needs the Navy, number one, right? Your performance, your desire is always at the bottom. And I think we already talked about, we know what your desire is, but did it work out? You mentioned your friend that went helicopters. Yeah. Were there other people that, were happy where they went, maybe not as happy? Obviously you were happy.
I was happy and we had, I remember we had one guy went Hercs, one guy went Nimrods, and then one was the helicopter Sea Kings, and the rest of us all went to RAF Valley to do our fast jet, our advanced jet training.
Okay.
So we're on to the next stage.
But that's where.
Unless you have any more questions about the.
Well,
basic.
no, I'm trying to think. I make so many assumptions about what I did, right? The training that I saw, but it sounds like it was a lot more training. And then I just did a navigational flight, and we were 2,000, 2,500 feet for, we call it ONAVs, VNAVs, low level. Mm-hmm. I've been at the altitudes you described, how do I say this legally, in helicopters, number one, for clarity, over the water, in the mission profile we were supposed to be in, and perhaps in civilian aircraft, where there's no obstacles, no you know what I'm talking about? It's not a world that level of low-level flying is so foreign to me, but it seems so, and I know you're going to talk about it more, but
it's why I
it's incredible.
When you're low flying, particularly with there's any kind of rolling terrain, you're never bored. I mean, it's not like you're sitting up there with the autopilot on. You have, it's like sometimes it's like the scenes from Top Gun when he's going up the valleys. In fact, when we get to, there was a great valley up in Goose Bay, Canada, that we used to call the Star Wars Valley, and we would go down it, so low flying we always kept my interest.
Absolutely, I bet.
And as you'll see, we get that 250 feet. That was early days. We obviously operationally we did 100 feet.
Wow.
600 knots. So.
My gosh. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to hear about it. Yeah. Let's talk about RAF Valley.
RAF Valley is a base in the northwest corner of Wales. Wales are pretty unpopulated, lots of sheep, so it's a good place to do your flying training without too many noise complaints. The airplane they used was the Hawk, which U.S. listeners will realize is pretty much the T-45, the very early version. When the U.S. Navy took it over, of course, they had to McDonnell Douglas did a job on putting the tail hook in, and of course they had to beef up the landing gear for the heavy landings, and they actually moved the speed brakes, which in the RAF version were underneath. They put them to the sides.
That's right.
I think because they want the guys to be able to fan the speed brakes down the approach or something.
Yep. Yeah, we'll throw the boards out sideways, basically. Yeah. You couldn't do that if the hook was there.
Right. Yeah. So I believe the U.S. Navy one ended up considerably heavier. Now, they gave it as much of an upgrade on the engine thrust as they could, but I'm told the RAF ones were sweeter to fly because they were lighter and slightly better thrust-to-weight ratio. So we went to Valley, still red and white airplanes there, part of Training Command, and we did our advanced training, and when we did our low levels in that, now we're doing 420 knots. Notice for non-pilots, it's always a multiple of, so you can do easy math, basically. Divide by 60, or 7 miles a minute.
Yeah, exactly.
And there was lots of general handling. The Hawk also could spin. you had to really coax it. You had to go. The profile was very specific, 26,000 feet, Mach 7, and you had to go full pro spin controls. And it would actually get into a stabilized spin. As soon as the recovery drill in the book was centralize the controls, and it popped right out. So we did do some spinning there. But later on, I began to realize that when I was an instructor, it is just a superb training airplane. It's virtually viceless. It's so forgiving to the students in terms of, you could be, fighting this guy, looking up, stick in your belly and not really monitoring your speed, and it's not going to flick and depart on you. You could just sit there all day. So really a very, good airplane. And if you've had a T-45 ride.
I've not. I've had a flight in a Hornet recently.
Superb view.
I'd love to.
The front seat's good, but the instructor station, you're not looking at the back of this guy's bang seat. You are looking forward through the glass. So, not a fly-by-wire airplane, dual hydraulic controls, dual, backup, if you like, double hydraulic system, but very, very nice. If the Hawk has a Achilles heel, handling-wise, I would say they had lots of problems with the anti-skid system. They lost quite a few, went off the side of the runway during both takeoffs and landings, and you could tell what they tried to do. There were next to the throttle on the little console there was a few switches. Well, there was one even larger one, like a little paddle switch that stood up, because the whole idea was if you thought this thing had sliced off the runway, you could just slap your hand back down there, and the first switch you knocked backwards would kill the anti-skid. Of course, it had its own detriment there, because in a tight fighter cockpit, you have to be quite organized. We do these navigation exercises. You had to have your 1 to 500,000 general navigation map, and you had your own plan. I'll have that tucked under my left thigh, and I'll have my 3 1 to 50,000 maps for my IP to target runs tucked into this other thigh. And when I get up to the IP, the initial point, I'll get this map up, and you hack the stopwatch, and then so you had to be quite organized with your maps. No time to fiddle faddle up there, getting disorganized. When you're in the terrain as well. You're dynamo. So later, when I was an instructor, quite often you'd be flying along, and all of a sudden you'd get the master caution. You'd look down on the warning panel, and it would say anti-skid, because sure enough, this guy had managed to knock the switch off with his map. So you just calmly say, when you get a moment, just turn the anti-skid back on. You knew it wasn't a failure. It was just a common thing that happened in the student's helmet fire that was going on. He'd managed to knock the switch off.
Any good flights in the Hawk that you remember? Maybe emergencies or the weather. Obviously, low level. It's going to factor into it. I'm sure.
I remember, the way they are. We would fly all VFR, almost VFR. We get airborne VFR departure out into the low flying system. We didn't fly standard routes. Every day we'd get a big map out and get our, marker on plan our, So we were teaching students how to pick good navigation waypoints. They weren't picking up standard routes, so they were looking, and you might say, like the side of a hill or a hill with of course they would initially pick points that were far too small to see, and so you want that huge hill, but pick the little wood on the corner of it. Now you've got a big thing to see from a large distance, but an accurate thing to fly over, or a mast, or a corner of a lake and a reservoir and a dam or something. So they would learn to plan their routes, making use of terrain screening so they can go in the low ground. And we go out in the low-flying system, VFR, and then, the weather would, be on the mountains. You'd close in, and we would basically just go teach them this kind of judgment about how far can you take it before it's time to get out. And if you couldn't reverse out the valley, you just put the stick in your lap and shot up through the cloud. Now, we were trying to get an IFR clearance, but obviously they took a finite number of seconds to get onto the military. There was the RAF we used to use, or the whole of the UK airspace. We have military controllers as well as civilian controllers. So we just go into this London Mill kind of thing, and he would quickly identify you and give you vectors away from any traffic. So you didn't have to deal with all the civilian traffic on the frequency. But anyway, you were basically punching up through the cloud, hoping for the best, and quickly trying to get Now, if you had a wingman on you've got two options if he's flying with you. Either get him in close in time, and you can go up gently together, or sometimes it was like you just had to tell him, go up and give him a divergent heading, and you would spear out, and maybe you'd break out together, and you could rejoin on top.
That has to be such a steep learning curve as a student, such a high mountain to climb.
Yeah, because we were trying to teach them. I mean, there are regulations for what the visibility is required, but we were trying to teach them to actually sense it, to look at is there physically enough space between me, and the end of the valley to get around the corner into the next valley or not. Not actually to say, oh, it's only 4.9 kilometers visibility and I need 5, therefore, I'm obliged by the regulations to turn, to go back. And, so we wanted real judgment, and that had to be learnt.
Who were your instructors at Valley? Where did they come from?
Right, here's the hierarchy with that. When I was at basic, stepping back to the Jet Provost, most of my flying instructors were like from the heavies. They were, they'd been Hercules pilots or Nimrod pilots or Vulcan. We had a lot of the days from because the Vulcan fleet had just finished a couple of years before, the V-bombers. So when we were at Valley, now we're on fast jets, most of those guys had been things like Phantom pilots, two-seat pilots, Phantom pilots, Buccaneer pilots, that kind of thing. Later, when I'm about to tell you about the next stage of training, that's where all the Lightning guys and the Jaguar and the Harrier pilots. There was a sprinkling of good experience around, but that's kind of, you could tell almost the hierarchy when instructors were posted back, depending on your experience, where they would end up. So we're talking about Valley now. A lot of my guys had flown the Phantom, F4 Phantom, the Buccaneer, a naval strike aircraft, which was handed over to the RAF. We remember the very first guy who flown the Tornado came back in this time because the Tornado was a brand new airplane that I ended up flying later. So those are the kind of guys that were our instructors. Hawk is a marvelous airplane, very reliable, actually fuel economic as well. I mean, you used to get up to, anytime you pulled up to altitude, you do your low level till you got down to bingo fuel. Now it's time to go back. And all you had to remember was it burned 1 kilogram per mile going back. Our fuel gauge was in kilograms. Yours is probably pounds here.
Yeah, of course.
But it was a kilogram per mile, and plus 50 for the climb. So you just had to, know how many miles you were. I'm 200 miles from base to make sure I'm 200 kgs above my landing fuel. Pull out and go home.
That's incredible.
Very simple fuel planning. I mean, you could, when you did proper navigation exercises, long cross countries, you would plan the fuel in, of course, more detail. But as just a general seat of the pants figure, kilogram per mile.
How many hours do you remember in that training?
Right, we did about 70 hours in the Hawk, and then we got our wings. So we'd got about 130 in the Jet Provost and 70 so about 200. Now I had got my other 100 plus in the Bulldog. That was just bonus. Some guys who didn't do the university route would have gone straight to the Jet Provost and missed out on that. They actually did a flying selection thing of about 15 hours on the Chipmunk. If they hadn't, wasn't really to teach you to fly. This was just for them to wash out the guys who didn't have the ability. But I had been through the Bulldog route, so I didn't have to do that part.
Sure.
So I graduated there in December. Got my wings December '86 at Valley, and then I was off to the next stage of training. But there was one more stage before we got to our operational plane. The RAF at that time ran 2 bases, which we called tactical weapons units. They used the Hawk airplane. They were actually part of Strike Command so now the little Hawks are painted grey and camouflage, and they have weapon pylons and guns on them and things. So this is what in other air forces they've called fighter lead-in training, or there's I think a new name for it now.
Lead-in fighter training I think is the Air Force term. IFF, Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals. Right. Yeah, that's the current term.
We would go, and I went to one of the 2 bases, which actually was on the southwest corner of Wales. Again, middle of nowhere, not much of a social life there. And we did. Now we're trying to it was a whole change of velocity. Now the instructors, you're part of Strike Command. You're not flying those red and white airplanes where we just taught you how to fly. Now we're teaching how to fight an airplane. And of course there was a few flights to get used to the more tactical formations, but now you're doing the BFM, the basic fighter maneuvers, 1v1, you're doing 2v1, you're doing a lot more low levels, but rather than just a nice little low level exercise for fun, you have targets that you're trying to find, and you have a gun sight in the Hawk, in that version of the Hawk, so you could come back with your film of the target right, your gun sight right over the target. On time, on target, and we got to fire the gun. We had the gun, 30 millimeter Aiden gun underneath, so we went to the range, did strafing, we did level bombing, dive bombing, everywhere stuff like that. So another 70 hours on the Hawk before we were ready for our operational planes.
That had to have been so much fun.
Yeah.
What did you enjoy the most, the gun or dropping stuff?
I think the gun. It's just something about it. Now, you're going to hear more about this because I ended up being an instructor on this later.
Of course.
But it's an Aiden gun. So it really comes from the 1930s, 30 millimeter, not particularly high rate of fire, but we used to carry 100 rounds in the pound, and you got 50 was your when the armorers in the morning would load like 150, and then they put like a blank round or something, like a dead round or something. So your gun would start firing at 50, and then when you came back and handed it over to the next guy, all they had to do was crank the handle once, and now you read the.
So two students could fly on that same pack out. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So 50 rounds, and you were taught to fire half-second bursts. So that would be about 10 rounds which should come out. So if you were a little, keen on the trigger, you wouldn't get your 5 bursts. And you had to qualify. There was a score on you. You were shooting. Now, ranging-wise, this is. There's no radar altimeter in the Hawk in our version. There's the gun sight was like an
iron sight.
Iron sight.
Yeah.
It was projected, but there was and you just had to, and it had a certain width to it. So the panels on the strafe targets were a certain size. So you went in until the cross kind of filled the panel, pulled your half-second burst, 6G recovery, and then because you were doing this pretty close in.
Where did you do that flying?
Those bases that were positioned, the 2 bases with the T, right close to a bunch of air-to-ground ranges, so you didn't wait 10 minutes flying from the base, so you didn't really waste time going back and forward. And then the Hawk would have these 2 canisters under the wings, which we called CBLS, carrier bomb light stores. So underneath of these canisters were 4 little practice bombs. So we had 8 little practice bombs, which would just have a little smoke and flare in there, so when they hit the ground, the guy could give you your score. And again, you were just doing iron bomb sight and dumb bomb bombing. No, the bomb is ballistic. It's not guided in any way. So, you learn the fundamentals of weaponry there.
So much fun.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, of course, we get to the end of that course. Now it's you're going to your operational airplane. So now there's another role selection board for what what are you going to go and fly, and you can put your request in.
What were your options? Where could you have gone at that time?
At that time, the Tornado was going hot and heavy. They were mid-'80s. That's when all the Tornado squadrons were being formed. Tornado GR1, the ground attack version. About a year or 2 after I came through, the Tornado F3 is the fighter version. That was a totally separate training unit. Because the airplane was so different. By that point, they had formed those the OCU, the training unit, then, but they weren't taking brand new first tourists. That took a couple more years, so that wasn't quite an option for me. But they still had the Phantom, the Harrier, the Jaguar, the Tornado, and actually the Buccaneer. The Buccaneer had a few more years to go, so none of us. It was like the old thing. So none of us young guys really wanted to go fly it. But actually, it turned out to have a little lease of life in the Gulf Wars, I'll tell you. But he only had a handful of years left in its service. Everybody knew that. So there was half a dozen choices, only of which 2 were single seat. The Lightning, which is I don't know if you're familiar with
such a beautiful airplane. There's one over at Stennis, Mississippi.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's a 2-seat.
The engine's one above the other.
One above the other.
It was just a rocket ship. And it went out of service in about 87, 88, so they weren't taking. They were drawing down to the final couple of years. They weren't taking new guys anymore, so that wasn't an option. So really, it was the good guys were getting the single seat options, the Harrier and the Jaguar, and I got the Tornado, which is a 2-seat airplane. Looking back on it, it was right for me. I mean, I put other things on my dream sheet, but that allowed me to really get good grounding with a guy in the back to look after me, and in a way that's a Tornado, a 2-seat airplane. You've got a buddy. First of all, it's the best kind of co-pilot because he doesn't want any stick time. He's going to file the flight plan, draw the route up. But when you land, now you've got a buddy to go to the bar with. So if you're single seat, and you divert, you're on your own. So I think CRM wise, it's the ultimate in CRM because you're not sitting side by side. There's no body language. It's all communication. As per you were talking with your students.
Absolutely.
Your CRM, the verbal CRM, has to be spot on.
How you carry yourself matters so much over the radio, over ICS. Yeah.
So I got the Tornado, GR1, as I say. The acronym which I've sneaked in a couple of times is OCU, which would be your FRS, your Operational Conversion Unit. Of course, it lasts about 6 months, and that trains you to fly your operational airplane. The Tornado GR1, the GR is Ground Attack and Reconnaissance, is what those 2 letters stand for, had a slightly different OCU because that was a multinational program, if you remember. It was built by a consortium of companies that included German companies and Italian companies and British companies. So the air forces of those three countries purchased it. And actually, the German Navy did too. And so they had done a bold thing. We've got the same airplane. For standardization, let's have a joint training unit. So they formed this unit at Cottesmore in England that had RAF instructor pilots, German instructor pilots, Italian instructor pilots, and then the airplanes on the line. It was a flight line situation rather than a hardened aircraft shelter. There's 40 airplanes out there. Some of them had big German crosses on there. Some had Italian red and green roundels on it, and some were RAF roundels. And you basically, the student courses, we had a course of 14, and we had German Air Force, German Navy students with, a lot of them had come off the Starfighter at that point, the 104. The Germans had just retired it, so they weren't very happy about going to the Tornado. But anyway, that's a different story. But we were paired up for crew. My crew navigator, student navigator, was a German guy who'd flown a couple of years in the F4, so he wasn't brand new, but and I would fly, and there was something cool about getting airborne in this airplane with big German crosses on it. I know we fought against them 70, 80 years ago, but those days are long gone.
It's a different world, yeah.
Now they're our allies, and they're very capable allies, and I find that was super cool. The airplanes between the nations were mostly the same. It's a bit like JSF, it wasn't actually as standard as it could be, or even your T6. I'm sure there's a small difference between the Navy and the Air Force. You'd get in the German one, and you'd notice that the little control head for the TACAN and the transponder and the radios were a bit different because they'd purchased those from different manufacturers and things. But by and large, it was the same. The British ones, when the instructors were trying to get an airplane assigned to you in your flight, the British ones are the most popular because they had extra fuel. A Tornado airplane, if you can visualize it, huge horizontal vertical tail, which in Britain we also call it the fin.
Shark fin almost, yeah.
Right, it's a huge fin. It actually had a fuel tank in the vertical tail with 1,000 pounds in it. So, which the Germans one didn't. I guess the Brits thought, the Germans are thinking, when we go and attack the Russians, they're going to be really close. We don't need that much range. But, for the Brits, we wanted a bit more. So we had 1,000. And the way that worked was, it actually was the first tank to feed. I think after you burn about 50 kgs in each of the center groups, then the fin would start. It was actually ungauged. It wasn't part of your totalizer. And you just got this little, you had fin F to say it was full, and then before you took off, you checked it was saying fin, and that meant it was feeding. And there was enough fuel in there to do your startup and taxi, afterburner takeoff, and then you cancel the burners at 250 knots, and you take a glance down to the fuel panel, and you want to see fin empty. And that was it. That was gone. 1,000 pounds to take off. Now, the reason you want to check it, and it really was part of your kind of departure checks, because if it hadn't emptied out, now you had a bunch of limitations. Because now you can't be doing rapid rolls with a huge heavy fin. You're going to break it off. So if it didn't feed, then now you're an airliner. You're going to have to just go around the pattern and land. But it didn't happen very often. I mean, I don't think I ever had it, but it was kind of a rare emergency, but quite a benign one. It just meant you didn't get to go and have fun with the rest of the guys. You had to come back and land. Then also midway through my time in the Tornado, there was one airplane that was lost because there was a leak from that tank down onto the hot engines underneath. So I remember we flew around for a couple of years, and the tank, we weren't allowed to put fuel in that fin tank, so we had less fuel. But basically the airplane was designed to have fin fuel. Like most fighter airplanes, the fuel balance was not left to right; it was front to rear kind of thing. There was an aft fuselage tank and a front rear, and it was like aft left and front right. Fred and Al, we remember, was how we mentioned it on the needles, and so one engine was feeding. So if you got an imbalance, you were more likely to get a pitch imbalance because you had a forward and an aft fuselage tank, and those are the ones that fed the engines. Of course, there were also fuel in the wings and in the underwing tanks, the drop tanks, and you could have fuel in you could actually even carry them under the fuselage too. There was a lot of fuel options. There was a refueling probe, which for the GR1 was kind of it's almost like an afterthought. It was a retractable, but it was kind of bolt on. I mean, when it retracted, it didn't disappear completely. It sat there, and so it could be removed. And I remember when you had this probe on, the AOA gauge misread by about 1 unit, so you had to remember that you had to come down and approach with 1 unit different than normal. So that introduces another way of flying. The topic AOA, angle of attack, was what we flew all the time in the HUD. head-up display. And for those who are not familiar with angle of attack, it's so much simpler because it doesn't matter whether you are very light or very heavy, it's the same angle of attack. Now, you will, in fact, be flying faster, but you don't really notice that or care. You just fly the angle of attack down to the deck and flare, and dead easy.
How would you manipulate the wings? Obviously, it's a swing wing airplane.
Right. The GR1 version had a totally manual. It was a lever beside the throttle quadrant with a little clutch in the front so you could disengage it and you moved it back. It operated in the same mode as the Tomcat, totally opposite from the F-111. The F-111 back was the wings were swept forward and forward. So they had the philosophy, well, I'm going fast, I must want to push all the levers forward. For us, wings back was the levers back. And there were 3 detents. There was 25 wing sweep, was the most forward one for takeoff and landing. There was another notch at 45 degrees wing sweep for general maneuvering. And then there was all the way back was 67 degrees of wing sweep for like a fast dash. And the reason the notches were there because you have to have some limit, you remember that at 25 wing sweep I'm limited to this speed and this G with it, and at 45 with an infinite number of wing settings in between. In fact, your list of limitations to memorize would have been impossible. And really we were only supposed to fly in the notches. In fact, we all knew that if you were doing a cross country or you're pulled out of your low level, you're struggling to get home, you're right on bingo. If you went to about 33 wing sweep, the gauge was that was about the most efficient for getting the most out of your airplane, and you were leaving it between the notches there. Maneuverability, this is a first generation fly-by-wire airplane. So it's analog computers doing the fly-by-wire. It actually flew pretty well. And, but fly-by-wire airplane is computer doing, so the pilot demand, gave it as a high wing-loaded airplane designed for low level, which gave it a smooth ride, combined with a fly-by-wire, so it's only, it's going to mush out all the other disturbances unless the pilot's particularly asked for something. So the handling was very good. Obviously a center stick, hydraulic. I think it was a 5,000 PSI system, which was actually quite high. So for controlling the vertical, the horizontal tail moved differentially for roll, okay, and together for pitch. Assisting the roll with spoilers. Okay, we had no ailerons because we had full span slats and full span flaps. One of the criteria, they wanted this airplane to land on short runways because they were worried about runways getting bombed during a war. So we had to be able to come back. So it had, let's say, full span slats and full span flaps, plus it had thrust reverse. Very unusual for a fighter. 2 engines. I think this is probably the only airplane I've ever heard of that the Rolls-Royce engines with variable geometry intake ramps in the front for supersonic flight, triple shaft engine, so a high pressure, an intermediate, and a low pressure compressor kind of thing, with afterburner and thrust reverse. That's quite complex. Not enough thrust though. 2 small engines. We all wanted more thrust, but I've had the pleasure of flying the 16 and the 15, and when you all of a sudden you go, wow, for a tornado pilot, we never had enough thrust, particularly because the airplane was designed for the low altitude ingress roll. So the engine designers had to do everything they could to get the best fuel consumption at low level, which in terms of bypass ratios and ducts, all the blade angles and things like that. Problem is, if you take it up to medium altitude above 20,000 feet, that engine's struggling. It's not designed for that regime. So when the world changed, and now we're not practicing against the Russians at low level, and we're now doing medium altitude attacks over Iraq, the airplane was struggling up there. But we hadn't practiced the tactics either. That's all to come. We've got this full span slats and flaps. We've got maneuver thing. There was a button on your thumb, backwards for speed brakes and up and down for maneuver slats and flaps. So you could, when you were turning hard, you could get the slats and flaps down a little bit, give you a better wing, and of course you'd slam the wings forward to 25. So it had the same terrain following radar as the F-111, but much more maneuverable airplane. I mean, you could turn, you could get the wings forward, get the maneuvers down, and it wasn't an F-15, but you could really maneuver away from a lot of threats.
What was the ordnance, the primary ordnance that the airplane carried?
So we had under wing, in the inboard stations under wing, usually had fuel tanks. We had the 1,500 litre ones, which were standard, and then day 2 of the Gulf War, they gave us the big ones that were only intended for ferrying because they wanted more range for our tactical missions. So we never flew it before in anger. So they had 22 50 litres. I think there's about 4 litres per gallon, isn't that? So that's about 500-600
I will
gallons.
trust your math on it.
Right. And then on this inboard, the stubs of those pylons, we had little rails for sidewinder missiles for self-defense. We had 2, and the fighter version actually had 4. They had the outboard stations. We had a chaff and flare pod on one side and a ECM jamming pod on the other, which actually for training we flew them all the time because actually they are good for weight alleviation. You're putting weight out on the end of the wings, stops the bending moment. So even for all training missions, we almost always, it's very rare to fly without those outboard stores on there. So all the weapons went under the fuselage. Had 1,000-pound and bomb was the RAF's main bomb at that time. We didn't have that many 500-pounders or 2,000-pounders. 1,000-pound bomb, we could carry 8 of those. If we put the paveway guidance fins on the front and the back, took a bit more space. We could really only carry 3 in a kind of stagger configuration. We could carry kind of various cluster bombs, a large number of those. But those was really that was our main ordnance. And the 1,000 pounds could either be slick for ballistic trajectories, or we had one with a retard tail for low altitude, high drag profiles.
I might be mistaken. There is I don't understand the weapon system itself, but basically taken at an airfield. I know that was the Tornado's bread and butter. Mm-hmm. What was that? It was a kit, almost something that went on the bottom of the airplane. I feel like I'm butchering something that's dear to you. So.
No, it's not. There's a weapon that we had called the JP-233.
That's the one.
It was an airfield denial weapon, and it went on the fuselage pylons there. So the front section of it had 30 cratering munitions, and we only had two of these rounds, so we had 60. In the back had 215 anti-personnel mines. So funny how I remember those numbers. So that's 60 cratering munitions and 430. So you would fly at low altitude over the airfield, mash down on the pickle button, these things would come out. So they'd come out and then little parachutes would deploy, and these things would come down, and as they sensed the tarmac there, they kind of exploded themselves, shot this plasma thing of hot metal into the ground, implanted itself in the ground, and then blew up. So it created what they called heave rather than a crater, because heave apparently is harder to clear. If you've got a crater, you get a bulldozer, sweep it in, you're done. If you've got this big bulge in your runway, it's harder to deal with. But sprinkled in amongst this are your 430 anti-personnel things, which look like giant baked bean cans with little legs on them. They are programmed to go off either at random from 15 minutes after drop to 12 hours, also, or they are sensitive to movement. So if you came out with a bulldozer to try and sweep these off, they had the little legs would catch. This thing would tilt over and shoot a plasma jet of molten lead through the bulldozer blade right into the operator. So you can imagine not too many volunteers to clear those up. Very effective weapon, could be dropped down to about 165 feet above the runway, but not high. I mean, you had to be down a couple of 100 feet. But the problem is you had to fly right over the runway to do so. And so that story's coming. So we did have, but what a nightmare. This thing, each of these rounds weighed 5,000 kilograms. So, and they're shaped like a brick.
Yes, very, very draggy. Yeah.
So now it's so draggy that you're having to fly. The angle of attack's way up, so now you've got more lift-induced. It was, and I've already said, there really wasn't enough thrust. We had afterburners, but once you'd cancelled the burner, at max mil power, you were struggling. It was hard. The thing flew like a beluga, with this thing on. So anyway,
we talked about the gun. I know in the training jet. Did you guys have the gun in the GR1?
Yep, we had 2 27mm Mauser German cannons in there, built in, so you couldn't see. Just
integral to the airplane.
Yeah, with 180 rounds per gun. So each gun had a training rate of fire. It was selectable on the weapons control profile, either 1,000 rounds per minute or 1,700 rounds per minute. So between the two, you've got 3,400 rounds per minute. Not quite a Gatling at around 6,000, but 27 mil, a little more punch than than a 20.
And this is not an air-to-air toy. This is a tool that you're going to use to take out tanks.
It was part, we used it for strafing, but clearly it's part of our self-defense. We had two AIM-9 Sidewinders and the gun to defend ourselves.
Oh, okay. So my thought was the ground attack airplane, the primary mission for that gun would probably be taking out strafing ground targets.
And it's angled a couple of degrees down.
It is.
So that you don't have to get into such a steep dive to shoot at a ground target. Which means if you're going to an air-to-air target, you really need to put a lot of lead ahead of it to get there. And there were modes.
Back.
I mean, we had mode. You click through the modes on the throttle, you could get to air-to-air. If you had to, you're talking a lumbering tornado, not much, you'd have to have a pretty ignorant Iraqi pilot in front of you to actually get an air-to-air kill. Anyway, we were still talking about Cottesmore, which was the RAF training base, learned to fly the Tornado, and it was great. The multinational thing was a lot of fun. I actually went in September when I started, so the Germans organised Oktoberfest, as only the Germans can, flew in all these Oompa bands from Bavaria and all the, German beer and this good snuff and all those things that the Germans like to do. So it was a great time. But then we had to do a second half because the nations couldn't quite agree on tactics and they had slightly different weapons. Our OCE was divided in two. We did this thing for 3 months as the multinational thing, and then we went to an RAF base and we finished our weapons conversion using, checking the RAF formations and tactics and weapons and things. So it was kind of in two halves for ours. And you could tell that the first part with the it wasn't. We took like 7 sorties to do, and you think if this had been the RAF, we'd have had like 1. The learning curve was much steeper. It had to be designed to be diplomatically friendly for the lowest common denominator. So really, it was a flying camp. Just had some fun. Learned to fly the airplane, which was and we did some crew solos and things. Which a crew solo would be you and your student navigator. You flew with an instructor for the first half a dozen flights, and then big day came when you've got you and your student navigator. So you've got, between the two of you, you've got like 10 hours or something.
A lot of experience in that airplane. Yeah. None at all.
Now the Tornado also came, what we called the strike version. So which meant the back seat was for the navigator. He had a radar display and various things, and a couple of flight instruments, just like an airspeed and altitude, and maybe a little tiny artificial horizon, but it's for his mission. We had trainer versions as well that had stick and throttles and a little bank of flight instruments and engine instruments, so that the IPs, the instructor pilots, could check us out on that. Every RAF squadron, the typical assignment, you had 12 airplanes. Usually a couple of them would be trainers. They were supposed to be fully mission capable, all the weapons. The navigators kind of hated it because half their TV screens were taken away for the flight instruments, and so they had to, all the little personal routines of which screen I put on which had to be changed when they flew the trainer version. But really, and obviously performance-wise, it's not like a single-seat airplane. When you create a two-seater, it all looks different around the nose. In this case, you couldn't tell from the outside. And of course, they had quite a few of the trainer versions at the training units because there'd be a lot of the basic sorties to fly with, when you're getting the students. Wasn't a difficult airplane to fly. I mean, the fly-by-wire, the head-up display, it really wasn't. It flew great ride at low level. You had a navigator and to look after you, share the blame with, or whatever, the navigator screwed up the intercept, and then we came back and did a bad landing, that kind of thing. It was a good airplane. In terms of emergency drills, we would do, single engine work and stuff. And
could you tell? Was there a lot of yaw?
No, the engines are right side by side. So yes, a tiny bit. But one of the cool design features, because the engine was side by side, is they had what they called a cross-drive shaft. So from the auxiliary gearbox, on a jet engine will run the typically generators and hydraulic pumps. So if one engine shut down, there was a clutch holding this apart. This clutch would engage and a shaft would drive. So now you're running all your hydraulic pumps, all your generators. All you've lost is one engine, none of your systems. So that could really only be done when the engines are next to each other, because a long shaft would, of course, wobble a lot. And that was a kind of a good feature there.
Was there ever any concern if you lost a motor, you could frag, for lack of better terms, your other motor?
I think it did happen. Yeah, I think there were some ones with guys that an explosive engine failure, and they're done.
Yeah,
it did. They ended up with a torch at the back there, and
Could you dump fuel? Speaking of torching,
we could dump, and we could, and we.
A little bit of yaw input in there, and you're off to the races.
You have to put the burner in for about 5 minutes, and it's all gone. But if you dumped and after burner 2, that fuel gauge would whistle out. I mean, we all have those little personal habits, like, when I'm dumping fuel, I take my glove off and I drape it over the HUD or something to remind myself that there's something very important going on I mustn't forget. And that you would do that, and I still do that in the airliners too. If you're dumping, you do something to, like you put the checklist on top of the throttle or something to say, there's something weird going on, guys. So just in case you get distracted, this to alert us, to remind us that we don't run ourselves out of fuel. So yes, we could dump. We couldn't do the F-111 trick because the dumping place was just not in that. You couldn't ignite your dumped fuel and do that nice thing that the F-111s always used to do.
I got to see one F-111 in Australia do it, and I just remember thinking, wow, it's exactly. It was like a Roman candle flying through the sky. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so cool. Yeah,
so we couldn't do that.
Tailhook on the airplane?
A tailhook for emergency purposes.
It's like a one-time blowdown, like the F-16 or 15.
Exactly the same. Of course, when the Tornado F3 guys got it, a lot of guys were all Phantom pilots, so they were just doing it for giggles. I will just do a arrested landing today, and all of a sudden the engineers who look after them went, "Hang on, this thing's only stressed for 35 applications in the life of the airplane. You've used like 33 of them or something." So they had to stop doing that quickly. So yes, it was intended for emergency. There's a variety of hydraulic failures or nose wheel steering failures that you went through the checklist, they dropped the hook, and most RAF airfields would have both an approach end and a departure end cable. Also very useful for a rejected landing. That was part of your rejected takeoff. Sorry, you have to stop in a hurry. You've got thrust reverse, you've got the hook, and you've got the wheel brake. So you had quite a lot going for you to stop you there. So you very rarely had to fly without a balanced field, i.e. an option to stop.
Obviously, the U.S. Navy design, there's a wire on either end of the runway, right? Mm-hmm. So an approach end cable, a departure end cable. Mm-hmm. What's the design? Is it the same? I know I've heard of a rabbit catcher or something on some airfields where it's actually almost a whole airplane barrier.
Yes, we had a barrier down in right off the end of the runway,
way on the departure end,
in the grass basically.
Yep, so and it springs up into action.
We could catch that too. Most RAF airfields were designed with that too.
Okay, you're going to hurt the airplane probably by using that, but
probably it's going to fly. I mean, it'll need some
it'll fly
repair.
again.
It'll fly again.
It's
not too bad.
So do you remember what year you finished fully qualified? You are a Tornado
guy.
So
I did my Tornado conversion training in end of 87 and the beginning of 88. I arrived on my first frontline squadron in May of 1988. I got posted out to RAF Germany. RAF had so many bases in Germany, it was actually a command size. This was the Cold War. This is what we thought the threat was. RAF Germany had 4 flying bases, 1 headquarters and 1 RAF hospital, so 6 locations. The bases were all right back in Germany against the Dutch border, kind of as far away back as you could get, to give us some standoff from the Russians coming over the inner German border there. The base I was on had 1 9,000-foot runway, 4 Tornado squadrons in hardened aircraft sites, 1 in each corner. So every airplane has its own little private hangar. Great for rainy days because you'd go from the PBF, if you called it, which was another hardened pilot briefing facility. It's where you plan your missions, and the van would drive you out. And then you could start with the canopy open in a rainy day. Start the engines in there and you taxied out. So when you you start the APU and you would open the back door of the thing, and then when you start the right engine, you open one door, start the second engine, open the other door, and then you taxi out. So unlike being on a flight line where you can look across and flight lead's looking for a thumbs up, you have to go on time. There would be part of the brief would be and at the particular second you'd come out and outcoming, and all those HAZs, usually RF, we shortened it, hardened aircraft shelter. They were all orientated a different direction, so that if we were ever bombed, and everyone had their doors open at the same time because we're all just about launching, the blast would not catch all the airplanes, inside like that. So there was 1 in each corner. So the wing had 48 airplanes basically. When you landed, you'd go into this little short taxiway towards your hardened, and you'd swing this hard turn around, with your wingtip only inches from the hard concrete wall. So the marshals were pretty precise there. Turn your tail on and you'd shut down. Now, wartime and for exercise, we would then drop the tail hook, and then this cable they'd have cabled the winch, whoosh, pulled you back in. Peacetime, we probably didn't fire that. They just took a normal aircraft tug and pushed you back in from the nose wheel. But you always did that turnaround. So you finished outside the hat. So if it was raining when you came back, you were getting wet when you climbed out. And annoyingly, the Tornado didn't have any ladder for the crew. So if you didn't have the ground crew support with that, so if you diverted to an FBO, oh my God, and then you're climbing up on a rainy, along the edge of the fuselage, onto the wing, down to the fuel tank, sliding off. I mean, the health and safety guys would have a field day for the danger there. And then getting up, you'd have the navigator would have to give you like a boost up as you'd climb up on the AIM-9 rail and then onto the wing tank and then onto the wing and then you walk along and get yourself in. So why some airplanes, they don't seem to bother designing that. And I know the 18 has a nice little ladder.
It does. It fits right up alongside.
The Hawk had one as well. They had little, but some people don't. And the 16, the same thing. Nothing to get you in and out. So if you have to do an egress because you have a ground emergency,
you're going to hurt yourself probably. Yeah,
hurt your ankle.
Falling off that airplane. Yeah.
And the 16 all slopes away. There's no real edge to it.
There's nowhere to stand.
It all just disappears on you there.
First world problems, though. I would happily fly an F-16 to have that problem.
Right. So went out to RAF Germany.
Okay.
25 years old, just about to turn 26. My first frontline. So I've been training for this basically all through university. I've been learning to fly the Bulldog, all these training courses. I feel like I've been training for 8 years for this, to finally arrive on the frontline squadron, to realize that I'm the lowest of the low, because I've got it all to learn. I can fly the airplane, but I've got to learn how to operate in theater. The squadron used to do we call a combat ready workup. It lasted about 6 months. So you flew a lot, sometimes, and you had a syllabus to go through. You had to fly single ship and then 2 ship and 4 ships, and then you had to go and do certain weapon events at the range, and we had to qualify nuclear as well as conventional bombs as well. So you're on the daily program or daily schedule, as you'd call it. Sometimes this was going to be your dedicated workup sortie, so it was all configured around what you needed. Other times you might be just making up the numbers because you're in the middle of a formation and it's somebody else's benefit to get the training. So, but anyway, it took about 6 months to get through that, and they kind of always trained you to one standard higher than you would fly. So if you were going to when you were qualified, you were just going to be a wingman, right? Basic wingman. But the check ride was to lead a bounced pair. So it's almost like if you can handle that, then you should be able to handle the simpler job of being a wingman. So it took about 6 months to fly that. Now this is Germany in the Cold War. The base, the NATO, and all that, they revolved around TACEVAL, tactical evaluation. So every NATO bases, they would get evaluated every 18 months on their readiness to go to war with the Warsaw Pact. So certainly for at least 6 months before that, that's all we totally focused on that. We had station level exercises. We had exercises where our command would come in and supervisors, and then and so you were I think you were doing 1 week in every 4. We played war. It was quite a predictable format though. Monday morning, 6 a.m. and then you would go in and now you're running around in gas masks, NBC gear, and all that, having to brief in under all those conditions. And every so often air attack, simulate air attack, and you have to put your helmets and your masks on and carry on planning and briefing and all those kind of situations. And then there was an aircrew respirator for NBC, which was like a sweaty rubber bag to wear on your head before you put your helmet on. Fortunately, the navigators had to fly with it, but for safety reasons, now we would have to do simulators with this to prove we could do it, but for safety, pilots didn't fly with it. And in fact, when we got out to do the Gulf War, we had a very sensible group captain, 06, who said, "This is a danger. We're in the desert here. It's hot. Frankly, we carried our normal side hat, hip pack respirator in the cockpit, because it's quite a roomy cockpit." He said, if we have a nuclear attack, and we practiced that a couple of times, flew downwind, put the autopilot in, took our helmet and mask off, which was weird because the cockpit was extremely loud, but we didn't realize it, put our respirator on, and then put our helmet back on, and then landed, no comms because we didn't have a microphone in it. So we're not going to wear this rubber bag on your head, which had been, I'm sure the Ministry of Defence has spent millions developing, but for practical purposes, it was very unpleasant. So we're in Germany. We're working up to this 1 week in 4. We're doing this simulated war. The tasking orders would come in from the headquarters, and we'd have to generate the airplanes. Quite often, what the armorers would have to do, they would do half up, half down. So they'd say you need to generate the airplane. So that was like you have to put 8 bombs on for a sim. So they would actually have to put 4 on, and they'd take 4 off, and that was considered to take the same time. So they proved they can generate the airplane, and then we could fly it without the live bombs on. And the war would always progress along the same thing. By Wednesday, one crew would get a nudge and say, you need to come into the special back room here and plan this strike mission. And then by Friday morning, all hell's breaking loose, and the whole wing has to generate all the airplanes in the nuclear fit and go off, and with all the code words for release and all this kind of stuff. And that, heaven help me, that's what you did not want to screw up. It was not being ready to go with the right code. Every airplane had a release code word in all these secure comms, and you did not want to screw that up.
Was that a very high standard of a lot is expected of you as a crew to do that mission set? A lot of training goes into it, I suppose, boards and just preparation.
Oh yes, we would rehearse all this. The nuclear drills and the switches were kind of different, and we got assessed on them. With regularity but actually when you got airborne on your supposed nuclear mission, you were now single ship, because that's the new. And so actually it was a real fly around the route where, I'm not flying a big complicated formation and nobody's bouncing me. So actually for training purposes, the actual airborne part was pretty straightforward.
Well, this is something that I've certainly have zero experience in personally, but you're probably the first person I think I've spoken to that does. Is it something that you would think a lot about? Is it something that weighed heavy on you as an aviator? That's a big, a big load for the airplane to carry, but honestly also for you as a person to carry.
Yes, I guess I didn't think of it as, I thought the only reason this is happening is because we're at war with the Russians. Things are going back. The world is pretty much ending, as we know it. The world as we know it is certainly ending. So I guess you never really know until you have to put your thumb on the button. But it wasn't bothering me an awful lot at the time, because I was young and I wanted to, be seen to be a good pilot on the squadron.
Of course, yeah. That's the job. That's what you signed up to do.
Right.
Yeah. Was it an alert part of the mission as well?
We had a part of the base was kind of wired off with several layers of barbed wire and an airplane with, the right kind of ordnance hung on it at all times.
Sure.
And when I first arrived, there was a crew there 24/7. And then later they thought the world situation was calm enough that actually we didn't have to go and sit and babysit the airplane, That would have been more nervous, to sit there in an airplane that's got a nuke on it and think, just waiting to get the call.
Yeah.
So we did, it was great fun. What a sociable squadron,
Yeah, living in Germany, what was that like?
Well, I didn't learn to speak German. I mean, we just lived in a little British enclave and socialized with each other. We got tax-free petrol, gasoline, because, hey, we're foreigners over there. So we were paying, and nowadays with the gas price as it is, that would be great, wouldn't it? So the gas price, we were paying, we had these little coupons that we'd take to the gas station. We bought them in our admin office in the squadron, and then the German gas stations would take them, and it was like 1/3 the price at the pump. And a lot of guys would buy tax-free cars to take back when they were finally repatriated back to England. I bought one, of course, but some guys actually made a business out of it, because you could take it back and sell it for more than you paid for it. Of course, you would have to declare that in your taxes. I don't know if they did, but I just kept life simple. I bought one about 6 months before I went back with a nice car. We're talking like BMWs and all those kind of things. People that wanted to get into those kind of things. Mine was actually a Volkswagen, but. Lots of deployments, lots of short training exercises in those days. We'd go down to Italy, to the island of Sardinia. There was a big air-to-ground range and an air-to-air range, which was instrumented. It called it ACMI. You have a pod on there that knows very accurately tracks the position of the airplane. So you did combat and intercepts and stuff, and you could go back and get this all replayed, the debrief. We would go in squadron exchanges with other NATO squadrons. We would go out to Goose Bay once a year, Goose Bay, Canada. To qualify in what we called OLF, operational low flying. That means every pilot had to qualify down to 100 feet. And you would do all these complicated tactics. And also you'd qualify in night or IMC terrain following. The airplane has, in the radome of the Tornado, there are two radar dishes inside the pointy radome. A ground mapping radar and a terrain following radar. The navigator can see the ground mapping radar, and he'll use that for updating the fix. The airplane has a single spinning mass inertial system, very old but compared to today's system, which would wander at about 1 mile per hour. So every 10 minutes or so, he would have pre-planned a very accurate fix, like the top of a mast or a big something would stand, or a corner of a lake that something would stand out his radar, and he'd be dragging it back, updating the kit every 10 minutes. Then when you'd get to the target, we use a lot of these what they call offsets. So to an exceptional degree of accuracy, you would have measured how many feet down and across from the actual target is something that is radar significant. And when we went into Iraq, it was the fences around their airport. They had these double barbed wire fences around the Iraqi airfields, stood out in the radar, fantastic. So he would drag the cursor onto this, and at the same time, because it's the exact distance to the target, you're dragging so if the target's not radar significant, you've still got it nailed.
Because it just knows the offset.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It knows the offset. So we'd go out to Goose Bay and we'd use this terrain following radar. That was the ultimate in CRM. The pilot had a little, we call it the E-scope, which was a sideways looking. You're looked about 6 miles ahead, and you could see this little ski slope type thing, and you could see the terrain coming in. It's a monochrome thing, just green and black. And the navigator would have the ground mapping radar, and he would say, right, I've got a ridge coming out in 10 miles, and you go, oh yeah, I can see it. So you're constantly handing off obstacles, towers, ridges. Commentary when you're doing terrain following was constant. At
night in the weather, just to be clear.
Oh yeah.
That's insane.
Now the other thing is we flew almost all our terrain following hands off. Autopilot, auto thrust on. So you coupled the terrain following radar to the flight director, to the autopilot. We put the autopilot on, the auto throttles on, and you're now flying along over the terrain with your arms folded, because you haven't got you could follow through on the stick and the throttles, and the stick and the throttles are just moving around. We developed a lot of confidence in that. This thing it was the Texas Instruments terrain following radar from the F-111. So, but it had been very well integrated in the Tornado. I remember we were working out from the Gulf out in Oman. We came across these real flat, rocky desert, a couple of sand dunes, and all of a sudden we're flying along, and the radar altimeter suddenly went 10 feet back. This radar, the density of the sand on there hadn't reflected back the radar thing, and so the terrain following radar had not climbed over these sand dunes. So that was nearly scary. We nearly scraped ourselves off on a sand dune. But mostly in Europe, it was a highly reliable system.
Why Canada for that flying?
Because
it's not close by. You have to fly all the way out there. Yeah.
Germany, like most Europeans, really quite heavily populated. Lots of airspace, airports, airspace you can't go into. You go to Canada, we would get given a piece of land the size of Germany for just our foreship to operate in. So, therefore, if we deconflict from each other, then with nobody else allowed to be in there at that time, nobody else to bump into. So we would go do night IMC 4 ships or 8 ships. And we did this system. The navigators planned this, what we call parallel track. So each side of the formation was following their own waypoints, which were maybe 1 or 2 miles apart. You had to be right on time, because there was a guy 20 seconds behind you. You could only be up to 10 seconds early or late. So you were there was a very good little display in the HUD which showed whether you were early or late. Just a little line up the dots kind of display. So you had to make sure you were on time on ground speed, because the NVGs came later. We were doing this night stuff on the kit, as we called it, on the gear. The inertial, the terrain following radar, and also when in daytime in Canada, with rainy day out in Goose Bay, it's kind of rolling terrain there, forests and bears and all this kind of thing, and you want to be visually flying anytime you can. You're more maneuverable, and you can defend yourself against threats. And all of a sudden, oh shit, comes the next rain clouds on the next ridge. Hit the buttons, get the terrain following radar, and it steadies down. Get over the ridge, right, and I click it off. So you were constantly going in and out. That was almost a skill in itself. And of course, sometimes you would break out and you could see your buddy flying a BMU 1 or 2 miles standard battle formation. And then, of course, you'd get to the targets, and they'd have these complicated split patterns, so you would running over the targets in different directions. to kind of confuse the enemy. You'd have to have a certain amount of spacing between aircraft, not for two reasons. One, so you didn't bump into each other, but also the weapon would affect you don't want to fly through the debris that's been thrown up from somebody else. But this is all the disadvantages of a low altitude. If you're tossing them in from medium altitude, you don't really care about the debris so much. So Canada was great fun because it was just great flying.
Yeah, it's a long trip to get there though. Tankers, I'm guessing.
Bay, Happy Valley Goose Bay is not the most exciting town to hang out in. I think it has like one steakhouse and one pizza restaurant, and that's about it. You're
not there for the nightlife.
No.
Yeah. There for the flying.
But what was slightly better was quite often we'd go from there to a red flag down in Nellis. One of the ways to maintain you had to maintain your tornado currencies, you had to go to Goose Bay once a year to qualify in this 100-foot flying. We went to red flag about once every 18 months, so it wasn't quite as frequent. But I went to to red flag in March 1990, and you'll see what's coming here because here we are, having a great time living downtown Vegas, operating off a big American fragmentation order is what I think it stands for. It's the air tasking order. It's what the air commander produces for the war for the next 24 hours. And then it would come out, it would be issued out for 24 hours. And remember in the days when computers would produce this little continuous paper with the holes in the side?
I actually do remember
this
that,
would be
yes.
inches thick.
Wow.
And every line is like a mission for like a 4-ship or an 8-ship. So that's how complex it is. So, we did red flag, and then about 9 months later, we were out in the Gulf operating off a American-led coalition. You can see why the training makes sense. And here, to add to this, summer of 1990, we did a squadron exchange with an American Wild Weasel squadron at Macdonald Air Force Base. They had composite. They had F-4Gs, I think, and F-16s. Wild Weasel.
The hunter killer. Yeah. It's a great idea.
Great. So squadron exchange, super. We went down there for a week or so. The emphasis was on the socializing, but we flew mixed formations, and we give each other briefs on what we kind of do, and then a week later they would come back up to our base and we'd return the hospitality. Got to know those guys pretty well. And then when we went out to the Gulf, we were in Bahrain, night one of the Gulf War. Who's assigned to be our EW support? Same squadron. So we call those guys up on the secure phone. We know them. Say, hey, we're going to do this. Oh, we'll be on your wing. We'll do all this for you. You think these things like red flag and squadron exchanges are just for giggles, but they pay off.
Yeah. Was it good flying in Nellis out in the desert?
It's flat. There's not much terrain for us to hide behind. There's no clouds. There's no bad weather. All the things that we could perhaps use to our advantage. So all the F-15s are rolling in on us and whatnot. But,
Yeah.
But the good thing, Nellis is live weapons. We're carrying, the big bombs that go bang. So, it's good you're flying the airplane heavyweight fit, which is good. You go in through the target and so when you deconflict with your formation, you really want to, boom, otherwise you fly through your buddy's bombs. So, we're pickling off the bombs. It's really good to feel them come off, and then the airplane leaps ahead with, it's lost all that weight and drag. And there's a lot of emphasis on the defense against the SAMs. We're dumping chaff and flares and seeing if we can break lock on all the SAMs and things like that. And because it's recorded like a big computer game, it's the debrief. When you do these training missions back home, you get into the debrief. It's just everybody's opinion of who shot everybody else down. It's really good to go to a place where it's all replayed and you can see what happened. You can see the air-to-air kills, and you can see where we dropped our bombs. You can see they've got the video cameras from the various SAM sites, seeing if they could track you. You can see when all the chaff comes out the back and they break lock, and we've got our jamming. See how effective our jamming pod is against. There were simulated Soviet threats, but I assume they were pretty good. So those about you're flying. We were clear down to 100 feet. We dropped live bombs, but all the we're flying over the desert. With F-15s around, that sounded like the Gulf about 9 months later. So, it was good value in that.
You mentioned 100 feet. Were there other players out at Nellis that were ever that low? I've always been told you guys have a very pretty legendary status, like the Brits fly low. Was there anyone else that kind of challenged that?
The F-15s wouldn't come down. They didn't need to, I suppose. They could look down, shoot down, but. I think some of the European nations would come, the Dutch and the Italians would come down that low as well. I remember being out at Goose Bay one time. There was a detachment of Dutch F-16s out there for their own training when we rearranged that they would come and be our fighter opposition. We was round the route, and they were flying those little F-16s down amongst the trees. So, they quite capable, and probably not a very regulated Air Force. So I think they had probably you're a long way
from the flagpole out there.
Yeah,
so.
Right.
Yeah. You mentioned 1991. I think that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah. So, Cold War was, the Berlin Wall had gone down in December '89, and, looked like the Cold War was winding to a close. But anyway, world changed, of course. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. They sent a few tornado squadrons out almost immediately. Some air defense ones went to Cyprus, I think, and just to look after our assets out there. Some tornado GR1s went out to the base. Our squadron was earmarked to go out in November. So those other guys had gone out, and that's quite good. They were there in case, they were Desert Shield, if you remember that designation, in case Saddam continued rolling into Saudi. But they established how we were going to work under this coalition, how we were going to communicate with the AWACS and the training routes and whatnot. So we went out and those guys went back, didn't get to fight the war. It's kind of a shame for them. But we went out in our squadron went out in November to Bahrain, which I know you've been to.
I have, indeed.
We were at, our airplanes were at the international airport at Muharraq.
That's where I was too, yeah.
Of course, there were Sheikh Issa base at the south had just been opened recently.
Just been built, like months before the war.
Months before.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of Americans living in tents down there. We were staying in the Sheraton Hotel in Manama. So that more like red flag. Stay in a nice hotel, go out for a nice dinner, and then go out and drop bombs.
I wish I could show you, and in fact, I probably will after this interview. I'll send you some photos of that island. It is so built up. I've seen photos. The only thing I have experience of is seen photos from that time, and it is so much bigger.
Yeah.
So literally just building islands out of nothing. They pump sand in and build up. Yeah. The Sheraton. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's still there.
Yeah. So our squadron had to send 12 crews. Our normal strength was 15 crews, so the youngest guys didn't get to go. They wanted, guys who. So, and I had been on the squadron a couple of years, 2.5 years. So I was ideally placed. I was no longer a brand new guy who was a liability, but on the other hand, I wasn't in the squadron leadership where I had a lot of responsibility for deciding the tactics and looking after it. So really, it was a perfect time to go. In terms of where I was in my experience, I could hold my own, quite capable. I had a young navigator who was actually the youngest guy. He'd only been in the squadron about 6 months. So that was perfect. There was no conflict of cross-conflict, experience gradient. Like sometimes if you were a young pilot and you flew with a really experienced navigator, who was going to actually... pilot's always the captain, but you got to respect the experience and of the guy you're flying with. But anyway, for me, I had a nice, we had a good relationship. I mention him because our squadron, peacetime-wise, we used to produce the daily schedule, just throw names up there. We just flew with all the navigators, whoever it turned out to be. Other squadrons didn't do that. They had constituted crews. But when the Gulf came up in September and we were all going to go out, they said, right, we need to get qualified in airway refueling, we need to do a bunch of things. And they produced all these crews. And I flew with the same navigator in the same foreship, with the same position in the foreship for 6 months every flight. Which was, because in peacetime, you're always trying to say, well, let's give him a chance because it's his work-up ride to become a leader, blah, blah. So you're always training, and you never get to fly in your designated position because you're kind of supervising from somewhere else. So now I had the same navigator in my logbook for 6 months.
Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
It was very good for that.
Hard crewed, know one another to a T.
And we shared a bed, I shared a hotel bedroom with this guy, So we were always assigned to the same flights. So I mentioned the tornado squadrons in Germany were not air-to-air qualified. I guess they figured our targets would be in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia. We could get there and back. The UK tornado-based squadrons were air-to-air refueling qualified because they felt they had a bit further to go. So all of a sudden, hey, we're going to go out to the Gulf, but tanking is going to be what it's all about. So a quick rush program in getting tanking qualified day and night. We also had never flown with that JP233 munition, even though that was our primary. We've never flown it for training because I guess there weren't that many spare units. So they managed to find one that hadn't been shipped out to the Gulf already, and we all had a chance to fly one flight with it, discover how draggy it was.
And you're not obviously employing it; you're just flying with it on a jet.
Just flying to see what it felt like.
Could you pickle it? Could you punch it off the jet if you needed to?
In fact, there was one. They let the guy. These other squadrons who were out there before us in the Bahrain. They were doing some training flights over Saudi. They decided to arm the guys up with the JP233 for let them fly, heavyweight warship over the Saudi desert.
Yeah. Try it out.
And one guy managed to pickle it off on a simulated target, which was just a desert, crossroads or something, no people there.
Thank God.
So yes, you could.
It comes off.
It comes off.
Oh, I'm thinking of the aerodynamic characteristics of that big giant thing coming off the bottom of that fast airplane.
Well, I'll tell you about that. So we got, we kind of, life got more serious. We did all these training flights. For another example, for peacetime, because the engines were, they derated the engines to save engine life. So when you would go to mil power, you'd get like 94% N1. And I think as if the airplane didn't fly a pig anyway. Of course, now we went out to the Gulf. This is for real. They tweaked it up. So when you went to mil power now, you saw 100% on the gauges. But of course, it was much hotter there.
It is so hot, yes.
Yeah. But, at least and we got, all the things that we hadn't had before, like half-quick radios, so we could, communicate properly with the AWACS on secure frequencies and things like that. So, and there we were. We were out by end of November in Bahrain, which, as you know, was probably about 6 or 7 weeks before it all started. We did a lot of training flights around Saudi, down to Oman, some spectacular valleys down there.
I'm told there's a Star Wars Canyon in Oman as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And working with our tankers and our support. The RAF had a squadron of VC-10 tankers in Riyadh and a squadron of Victor tankers, which are old V-bombers, converted tankers. They were co-based with us in Bahrain. They were actually easier because we would just brief face-to-face with the guy, taxi out, he would take off first and we were going to follow him, and the rejoin was a given. Was that the guys who coming out of VT, now we had to arrange a rendezvous and tank that way.
How does the Tornado tank? Is it good behind the basket?
It's not bad. I mean, it's a drogue. I mentioned that, it's not a boom like I got to do later with the F-16. And you've got the probe comes out on the right, and then the navigator coaxes you in. So you're going, you get stabilized, and he's going up and right. Oh, you missed high and right, kind of thing. So you have to control I do remember there was one trick. So the HUD head-up display had a kind of you normally flew in what's the word, unlocked mode. So it was a velocity vector for where you're going. You could put it in locked mode so that it was just rigid, and they wouldn't. And then you dialed a certain amount of mils in the sight, where the altitude in the top right would say like 20,000,000. You put the comma on the hose, and you ran the comma up to the hoodoo, hose drum unit, and you were going right in the basket. How do people learn that? Some weapons instructor had worked that gouge out, pass around, worked every time.
Works every time. That's so cool.
You put the comma on the altitude, run it up the hose.
And you still remember it too. That's the incredible part. Yeah.
The rate of fuel flow, of course, a lot less than on a boom. You've plugged in for quite a long time. I much preferred that those tankers would have wing baskets as well as a centerline basket. I much preferred the wing. The hose on the centerline was much longer, and it swayed around. Secondly, you were so low, the tanker was almost out of your peripheral vision. You hadn't anything to focus on. Whereas the smaller, shorter hoses on the wings, you were looking at the back of the...
And this was day and night tanking as well. What's it like in the night?
Well, there's lights. There's traffic lights to tell you when you're... there's little lights around the basket and whatnot. The tanker's usually got his lights on. Later, when NVGs came along, they, of course, had to be those green NVG type
slime lights. Yep.
So we did all the night. For me, night was our bread and butter, but it was all done on the terrain following radar on the inertial kit. NVGs were not our thing yet. The RAF Harrier Force was getting qualified on NVGs. They did a lot of night stuff on goggles, but we had not done it by then. Except on night 2, they said, "Oh, we got all these goggles. Who wants them?" So we started flying with goggles. No training. really. And we didn't change. Fortunately, we didn't change our tactics. We realized that we've worked how to do it with the gear. That this is just a bonus, but actually, it's a scary bonus because now at night you can see the bullets coming from miles away. So I'm not sure it was a great thing, but we didn't need them for our tactics. So we were living in the hotel, going out every night, just like a red flag. The British community out in Bahrain kind of welcomed us with open arms because they kind of felt that we were coming to their rescue to keep Saddam away. And so we were getting invited to dinner with all these British families and things, But anyway, as the war was getting closer, the deadline, it was the UN deadline, which I think was 15th of January. It was becoming, and we still couldn't quite believe, because we joined the Air Force in the Cold War, which, we were practicing for, but didn't really feel it was ever really going to happen, And all of a sudden, you're out in a theatre where there's a deadline approaching, and you think, this is beginning to feel real. And we'd been doing a variety of day and night training. About a week before the deadline, we went on to flying nights right at the middle of the night, taking off at 2 a.m., landing at 6, taking a sleeping pill, when you got back to the hotel to try and make sure you got, and you complete. So we had completely got our body clocks adjusted for nights. The UN deadline passed, and we got the nod that we're going in. So this is what happened. So the air commander, RAF 2-star, was out. Decided to pay us a visit for a bit of a morale thing for So we go back to the hotel. We pop the pill, go to bed at 9 o'clock. Next thing, the phone rings, and it's the ops clerk from the thing saying, "Guys, get in the vans, come back. The air marshal wants to." And we get, "Are you kidding me? I've just popped a sleeping pill. I'm fighting." So we all put our clothes back on, fighting waves of tiredness because we've just popped the sleeping pill. Get back in the vans, go back just into the crew lounge there, where the air marshal is saying, "We just wanted to wish you gentlemen good luck, and we're all counting on you." And thinking, and he said, "Oh, your generation." So of course his generation was Cold War. He'd never dropped bombs in anger, and now you could see we were going to get to do it. So they were a little jealous, I think, of those senior officers. So you, and I remember actually saying, "You guys are so lucky to be doing." And of course, I look back now and think that experience was valuable. At the time, I'm about to go to get shot at for the first time that night. I didn't think lucky was the right word. And I thought, what an idiot to drag us out of bed, disrupt us from our sleep pattern, just so he can come and give the senior officer, be seen to be, rallying the troops.
If I had to guess, he probably had no idea that had been done to y'all, probably. I've learned a lot of times that leadership doesn't even know.
No.
Yeah.
So now we're at 17th of January, with the night off. It all kicked off in the small hours of the morning. We go into work, and we've actually planned the first. We've got our target well in advance from this American frag order.
What was your target?
Our target was Tallil Air Force Base on the Euphrates Valley, about 150 miles up from Kuwait there. We go into work, we brief, we've got most of our flights, we flew as 8 ships. 8 Tornadoes. We had 12 there, but so we had some spares. We would typically have fighter escort, like 4 F-15s or something, allocated to protect us. EW support, either Wild Weasels and EF-111s, or sometimes Growlers and
Prowler.
Prowler, yeah.
Yeah.
So Prowlers, yes.
Yes.
The EA-6, yeah. So it was a package, RAF really didn't. The RAF fighters were in theatre, were the F-3 ones. They were told to defend Saudi from any attack, so they didn't get to support us because they lacked some important electronic identification stuff, and they just said, "No, you can't come." So we briefed, and we walked out the airplanes. Normally we would step, the Tornado was always a rush. We'd step out to the airplane 30 minutes before takeoff, and it was always a rush to get in the airplane. We stepped out an hour in advance, so plenty of time to get everything in. If there was in fact, some people even had, if there was a fault on the ECM pod, there was time to download it, put a new one on, and all this kind of thing. Long time to sit there in the cockpit going, and the ground crew on the headset, and saying, "Are you really going to go and do it for real, sir?" So, well, I think so. And they couldn't believe it either. I mean, this is a generation, we hadn't been to war. It's a different, post that and post 9/11, all the wars we've done, Bosnia and all that, guys who join the military now have a high expectation of dropping a bombs for real. For us, this was a shock. But we took off, and we, in the dark at about 2 a.m., and went out to find out. And we'd been assigned 2 tankers, 2 VC-10 tankers were coming out of Riyadh. So about 1 tank for each 4-ship. So you got when you're not refueling, you got about 2 on each wing. The rejoin that we practiced many times was like a head-to-head thing. They would come at us 1,000 feet above. You had dialed up an air-to-air TACAN frequency, which would give you range only. And then we're coming down each other, and then when they saw 12 miles, I think it was, they would start a rate 1 turn, 30-degree bank turn, and they would just magically roll out a mile in front of us, right? And you'd just watch the range ticking down, and all of a sudden a mile, and then you'd see the lights, and you would close up. So we're on night 1. It's all a bit tense, and I'm watching I'm on the wing. I think I'm number 6 of an 8-ship, right? So I'm on the. I'm watching the air-to-air TACAN go. It's all comms out. There's no, for security purposes, there's no radio calls going on. And I watch the air-to-air TACAN range, and it goes 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 5, 6, 7, lights go overhead. For some reason, they didn't turn. We've blown it. We think, this is night 1 of the war. In fact, the war hasn't even started yet. It's going to start in about 30 minutes. We had the most fantastic lead navigators in this flight. There wasn't the little route, tanker route. There was a few bends in the route, but not many corners to cut. But somehow he managed to marshal these tankers, give them a heading to fly, got us rolled out, and we managed to get behind the tankers in enough time to plug and get the gas. So the day was saved. But I almost thought we'd blown this immediately. How does that happen on, night 1 nerves? I don't know. So typically we would fly northwest, paralleling the Saudi-Iraq border from Bahrain, standing off, I don't know, quite a few miles from Iraq. Two refueling brackets. You would go into the tanker almost immediately and top up. You might say, well, why don't you just wait till it? Because the slow rate of fuel flow, it takes quite a while. You, as a formation leader, you want all your formation to depart the tanker into the tactical phase with everybody as full as possible. So you don't want, if you've got the last 2 guys taking ages, then everybody else is burning down from full. So you're much better to keep cycling guys through, keep them topped up, and then you depart the tanker with everyone as full as possible. So we depart the tanker, we turn the lights off, drop down to low altitude, start getting into our parallel formation. The Tornado front cockpit has a moving map display, actually a projected moving map. It's actually film. Nowadays it's digital.
It's literally a piece of film that's being run. Yeah. It's so incredible.
Of course, it was loaded for Germany theatre when we got to Saudi, and it was loaded for that theatre. So it's got peacetime airspace markings on it, and it's got the Saudi-Iraq border. So you see this line coming down, the border, because that's how. And then actually we saw a little bit of AAA going on. So, only on the first night. I think there must have been some border defences. I think, or maybe it was Apaches who were shooting out the border fences or something like that. But we saw a little bit of AAA that also told us it was the border. But really, it was the scary thing was the fact that the map just went off. Oh shit! I'm now in Iraq now. The AWACS, we're on one of our radiuses on AWACS, and he's American AWACS, and he's calling in targets, and the F-15s are rushing over to get him and whatnot. It's quite a lot. The first couple of nights were quite lively like that. But we thought, well, he's calling these because I guess they came up a little bit. We didn't know whether to maneuver formation away from that. Yeah, we just stuck on the plan. We had about 40 minutes probably from the border to Tallil Air Base. Big airport, military base, 2 parallel runways and 2 parallel taxiways. So basically 4 surfaces that they could take off with hardened aircraft shelters, complexes in each corner, and as I mentioned, big wire fences around it. Terrain very flat around there. We were quite a long way away, split out into 2 4-ships, so that these 4 ships could attack at 90-degree crossing angles. So I remember I was number 6. Well, now I'm 5 and 6. We're now at the front of our 4-ship. And the other 4 actually go through their target. And now, guess what? We've got a 90 right. So all of a sudden, I'm out in front. And we're going along, and it's our first night at war. And I said to Panavia, he said, look at that. Over in the 2 o'clock, there's this huge dome of green light and things going on. I said, what the heck? He says, Bruce, we're about to turn right. That's our target. So there had been the war had started like literally 30 minutes earlier with cruise missiles, and then that's what kicked it all off. Some U.S. Navy A-6s, I think, had been in to bomb some hangars or something on the airport. They had just stirred up the defenses. Good for us. We had no surprise. The AAA was firing. So we get to the point where time to turn in. We do this in-place turn. So I'm now front of four. And I watch our front four go through, and all I could really see was the little white explosions of all their little bomblets coming out of their JP233. And I count 1, 2, 3, 4 go through. So now there's nothing to collide with. So I think, let's go. We planned this run. The tack run was planned at 480 knots, which was really all we could manage with the draggy JP233. But I thought, I just floored it. I thought, I don't care about timing anymore. I put the throttles in mil power and just let the speed out. And it probably crept up to about 520 or something. That really was as much as we would get. We're terrain following radar, but I wanted to be more maneuver. So I took the autopilot out, looked at the radar altimeter, and came down to, the lowest setting on the terrain following radar is 200. It's like a rotary knob. You set anything from 1,000, 750, 500, 200. So when I clicked it out, we're at 200 feet above the desert. And I think this is flat calm, but I want to get down. I knew that the JP233, the optimum altitude for release was like 180 feet. You'd still get optimal weapon effects. You could go down to 165 and you get pretty good weapon effects. Below that, it's not going to have time to function. So I basically took it down to about 160 to 180 feet in the dark on the radar altimeter, max dry, straight through. The target was just this waving lines of yellow and green and red tracer, which kind of would go up for a certain amount and then I guess it would burn out. And so all of a sudden you thought, I wasn't there yet, but what do? Is it better to weave around? But this thing's moving all the time. You could just move it, or you would just hold a straight course and, hope that you're okay. So the navigator's, calling out there's a checklist procedure, before you do an attack run, make sure all your weapon switches are right, and we get all our weapons are live, our switches are live, ready to go. He's marking the target. I've got a head-up display, but there's really not much I can see, beyond the green writing. It's black in there. And I hold down the commit button, which means that so the pickle button can either be live, so you go boom, and it comes off, or for a pre-planned attack where you're designating it, you hold it down, and then as the cursor runs through, it comes off at the right moment, and that was the case for this. So I held down the commit button, and I think I basically just went through maybe a couple of small jinks, but I just let all this wavy lines go around, and then which is all the submunitions coming off, and then at the end, bang, bang, which is the canisters self-jettisoning them. There's no why carry around that drag once you don't need it anymore. And the airplane just leapt. We were like 600 knots before off there. And I did a big kind of turn to part of the rejoin maneuver to get together with the others. And then we made our way back and checked in with the AWACS, give it kind of, mission success kind of thing. We had to find the tanker one more time to top up before we went home. And then we landed in it's about an hour's transit back to Bahrain. Landed as the sun was coming up about 6 a.m. Taxied to the ramp. It's full of TV crews and all this kind of thing. And came down the ladder and, a microphone stuck in your face, and not really trained for that. There was a lot of media interest at the beginning of the war. And that was the first night. The air war lasted 42 days. I flew, looking at my logbook, I flew 21 missions, so an average of one every other day. A few of those were, I've written DNCO in my logbook, duty not carried out, because we had a problem with the tanker or the bombs or the radar. So I didn't actually drop. I think there was 3 or 4 nights that I just counted the ones that I got airborne on 21 times. We did about a week of the low-level attack missions using the JP233. Sometimes we used the 1,000-pound bombs. We were losing. The tornadoes were taking some losses, about 1 per night. So we tried to do some more suppression of the AAA. So we would have half the formation, toss in 1,000-pound. We could see on the satellite pictures where these gun emplacements were. So we'd kind of toss the 1,000-pound bombs into an airborne explosion thing, just trying to get them suppressed a little bit before the other guys came through. We tried a few tactics like that. But that phase lasted about a week. We took a bit of flack from the media, but also the other air forces about, what the heck are you guys doing down there? But that was the only way to deliver that weapon. And when you took it at face value, we had practiced that tactic. There's three things that are going to shoot you down: a SAM, a fighter, and the AAA. And we figured that if we fly down low, they had some Mirage F1s and some Fulcrums, I think, MiG-29s. We felt that they didn't have the radar or the skills to get us if we were below 1,000 feet. So we kind of thought that eliminates that threat. They did have some capable SA-8s and Roland missiles that could get you down low, but the lower we got, we had some jamming for that. So, we kind of, again, didn't worry about that too much. So that only left the AAA. Well, only, of course, is an understatement. But anyway, by the end of the first week, we felt that the SEAD campaign, Suppression of Air and Air Defenses, which had largely been conducted by the American forces, targeting all their SAMs, all their fighters and whatnot, had been effective enough that it was safe enough for us to climb up. So we got rid of the low altitude tactics. We started going medium altitude. In the dark still. We had about 2 weeks of doing missions, medium level deliveries. We felt we might as well have been a Lancaster in World War II. We were dropping unguided sticks of 8 1,000-pound bombs, trying to designate it using the ground mapping radar, which is not very... The ground mapping radar, if you're at a shallow angle, it can calculate the range, but as you come up, when the angle comes down, it's a lot less accurate. The geometry is. Plus, you've got all the various winds that the bombs are going to fall through, which you have no idea of. So stick bombing against large targets is all you can do. The targets for that 2 week period were like oil refineries and massive ammunition dumps, which blew up great. I mean, such that you would blow up an oil refinery and then you come back the next night to hit the next one up the road. On the first one, it's still burning. So we were it had to be targets of that size, and it was not lost on us that the Victor tankers that they could carry 35 1,000-pound bombs in conventional load. We and our 8 ship could only carry 32. So why weren't they just... But no, we were more maneuverable. We had all the gear. They were only trained to do tanking. But we were basically doing World War II level bombing.
Is that something that you all internally as the Tornado community wanted, or fought? Someone else kind of tasked you, hey, we're not going low anymore, so this is your only option, basically?
Yeah, this is what I said, that I didn't have the responsibility of making these decisions. The tactical weapon leaders on the squadrons were saying, we think this is right, and they were deciding all the fusing for the bombs and what the tactics were going to be. And so I was just told that, hey, this is what we're doing tonight. We're doing medium level, about 20,000 feet, 20 to 25,000 feet. Going in, just dropping the bombs.
And like you said, the airplane's not efficient up there.
No.
And the engines aren't efficient up there.
So we're lumbering around. But we still made sure we had our F-15 support and our Wild Weasels and our EF-111s and Prowlers and things. So we did that for 2 weeks. So now the war is about 3 weeks old, and we actually went to daytime ops. Initially, we were doing high-angle steep dive, 45-degree dive, rolling in on largest targets with sticks of bombs. I had never done that. We were low-level philosophy Air Force, and so narrow-minded actually that we hadn't done. So maybe the guys who had gone to down to weapons school and maybe they had maybe tried all these different methods of weapon attack, but I had never done a 45-degree dive bomb before I did it for real. So we did that for a little bit. But then what was coming was the precision munitions, the LGBs, laser guided bombs. They were two types of targeting pod. One was an older generation, not stabilized, that kind of had a TV and an IR mode, and it was usually carried on a Buccaneer aircraft. One or two of the Tornado squadrons had practiced this, as a sort of specialist, unit, but most of us had never done any LGB operations. We in Bahrain had a squadron of Buccaneers came out, and we did one training flight. Not all of us. Like a couple of guys went off over the Saudi desert, worked out some basic tactics, came back, said this is the best way to make it work, and then we went off and did it for real with the Buccaneers. Tornadoes were at two other bases, one at Dhahran and one out in the west at Tabuk, and they had the Brits had ordered a new targeting pod called TIALD, Thermal Imaging Airborne Laser Designator. It was still on the manufacturer's developmental workbench. But they came out with the 2 only examples and the manufacturer's reps, put it on the airplanes and did real, development work for real. So they and that was self-carried by the Tornadoes on a different weapon, a different pylon. But we were using the Buccaneer guys. So we would fly, typically the formation would be a 1 Buccaneer designated airplane and 2 Tornadoes would ride on his wing. And that's when we had 3 1,000-pound laser-guided bombs on each airplane. Our targets initially were bridges and things. We took, and that's where we came back. Because when you drop those other bombs in the back, you came back and, well, how successful was that? I don't know. You can look at the radar tape, but that doesn't really. And it would be days. We'd have done several more missions before from photographs would make our way back to see how well we'd done on the first night. Went to the LGB ops. What's good is you've got your own videotape. So when you come back, your flight is debriefing. You put it the big VHS tapes. That's what they were in the TV, and you could see the bomb going in, the building, the bridge exploding, or the building exploding, and so you knew with a much better, your own BDA, battle damage assessment. Then, as the ground war was obviously approaching, they wanted to make sure that if there was any remnants of the Iraqi Air Force left, that we made sure they kept them. So we switched back to the airfields, and now we're putting LGBs into hangar roofs and making sure that they, and sometimes into intersections of runways and things like that. If especially the Buccaneer guys would occasionally find like transport airplanes on the airplane, they'd put the crosshairs right on there and make sure we blew that up good. So we did finish the last couple of weeks doing the laser guided ops. There were days when it was too hazy, the laser would not work. There were times when the bombs would inexplicably not guide properly. So you either got a direct hit or miles away. We did bomb that bridge at Fallujah, Fallujah was famous because we bombed what the Iraqis claimed was the baby milk factory or something, and lots of civilians were killed or something. But we bombed a bridge right there. But I know we saw that one. We actually hit the bridge and dropped it. I don't think we had any bad, what do you call it, collateral issues there. And then, the ground war went on. Was over before we knew it. 72 hours, and ceasefire happened, and
Kuwait's a small country. I don't think a lot of people appreciate it. I've flown through a decent amount of it in a 53, and it's not that big.
No, I never dropped a bomb in Kuwait. It was all in Iraq, actually. So I think some of the Tornado missions did because I got to see it later. So basically, as soon as the ceasefire happened, they actually armed our. Put American cluster bombs on our airplanes and sat them there ready to go. I guess they felt if they were needed. But basically, we did nothing for about 4 weeks. One day, I got on an RAF Chinook helicopter, and we flew up to Kuwait and had a look. We went out in the desert to these big parks where they were dragging in all these Iraqi tanks and armored personnel carriers and ZSUs and all this stuff, and we were able to clamber all over it. And of course, they're usually just like one neat hole where it's been hit. We went to a barracks where there were these big craters in the parade ground that had been some of our Tornado boys had made. We saw all they went past all those oil fields. Remember, Saddam basically torched them all. It was noon and it was black as midnight because there was so much smoke in the air. Quite depressing, that. But an interesting kind of post-war visit to the battlefield, sitting on the back ramp dangling your heels over the ramp of a Chinook and looking at it all. And I think we did one training. Eventually, they said, "Well, we better keep your currency up a little bit." So we got to fly one flight, and we went out over the Gulf and did a little fly past the USS America. I think one of the carriers was out there, and I'm not sure if we ever did establish good proper permission, but it was time to buzz the tower, Mav, that kind of thing. So 4 weeks later, we were all sent back to Germany. So 4-month deployment, 42-day war, and that was really my only time I dropped bombs in anger. What I went into, as we'll discuss, some training appointments, flight test stuff. The guys who stayed on the Tornado Force, the whole of that decade, they were out there 3 months on, 3 months off. The boring, I got to do the exciting bit. They were just, flying circles and squares over the desert.
Air defense, yeah.
And well, even if they were ground attack, they were armed up, ready to go. And
oh,
training
really?
missions.
Okay,
but just there was I think there was maybe a point in '98 where we did Operation Desert Fox. Saddam had been a bit uppity, and they dropped a couple of bombs. But basically, I didn't do that phase with all my Tornado brothers, the boring part, because I was doing other things. So within a couple of months of being back, I was posted. My 3 years first tour was up. I was posted, and I didn't see many of those guys. My 12 crews until about 3 months ago. We had a reunion, and we hadn't. It's not one of these things, but an annual reunion. But in the wonders of email, and you can keep in touch. We organised a reunion for the crews that our 15 squadron was our squadron number, and we had a reunion in London, and I hadn't seen those guys for 30 years. Actually, it was supposed to be 30 years, but that was COVID year, so we did it this year. It was 31 years, and most of the guys were there. We lost. We had 2 airplanes shot down, and one guy died. The navigator, pilot survived, prisoner of war, and another airplane was shot down, also prisoner of war. So we had 3 ex-POWs who'd been through a tough time. But it was really good to see those guys again. 30 years, that's like a lifetime of experience.
It literally is, yeah.
And we'd all done different things, but nobody had really changed. I thought we'd be unrecognizable, but it was just the same. So I hope we do a few more of those before.
I hope so, yeah. That's so cool. Mm-hmm. Looking back on it, do you think that the idea to go in low, that was the way that weapon was employed, JP223, let me make sure I get it right, JP233. Yep. Mm-hmm. So that had to be the way you started. Yep. Going to medium level, it maybe made more sense. I'm trying to look back and think, did it make sense in retrospect?
Yeah, I think so, because we were aware that there was a threat, and we didn't, you never quite know, they've got some fighters, they've got some SAMs, how good are they going to be at operating these? So doing that for the first couple of days, I think made sense. But it certainly tossed this flying over airfields are always going to be well defended. Have to fly right over it,
right over the top. Yeah.
So the RAF pushed big time for standoff weapons and guided weapons. In the 90s, we realized that our weapon inventory was way out of date, and they pushed hard for all the latest generations of paveway bombs. And the Tornado ended up, although the last Tornado flew in 2017, I think, in the RAF, but it ended up with different weapons like Brimstone and Storm Shadow, which I know nothing about, way after my time. Much more smart weapons and things than those days. So we learned our lessons, and we had to continue operating it as medium altitude, because that's what the scenario, the theatre really called for. But the airplane wasn't designed for that, and we hadn't really trained for that. We had, in some senses, we were lucky. We had trained for the Central European theatre to fight against a Soviet threat of SAMs and things designed in the 70s and 80s. When we got to Iraq, what did they have? Soviet-era 70s and 80s fighters and SAMs and things. So in a sense, we were well prepared for that part, our ECM jamming pods and all that. Nowadays, I think the RAF is wising up. We need much more multi-role fighters that can handle a variety of scenarios, and that's why we've got the Typhoon and now the F-35.
Not to wrap that up too quickly, but when we talk about OBBI, Bahrain International Airport, what else was there? I know it was just a massive airfield filled with fighters. Do you remember what other presence was on the airfield?
The Iraqis had F-5, no, not Iraqi. The Bahrainis had F-5s. They had just taken delivery of their first handful of F-16s, but they were so new. They only had them a few months, and I don't think they even participated in the missions. We were up in it was like operating out of the base ops kind of building, and the airplanes were all scattered around, the ramp. We did get, there were a few Scud missiles came our way that the Iraqis had launched.
From Iraq to Bahrain?
Yep.
Wow, I did not know that.
So, and there was a couple times they sent them over before the war started, actually. But, we got a big, alert of a Scud launch. And oh my gosh! And we were actually briefing for a training flight. This is a couple of weeks before war started. Oh, it was a bad scramble. Oh my gosh! Put your helmets on, your mask, because we didn't. Actually ridiculous. The chances of hitting us ridiculous. But actually before those Scuds landed back in Iraq. That was the Iraqis kind of rattling their swords a bit. Like, hey, we've got these things. Once the war started, they did send a bunch. Of course, they sent a bunch to Israel, trying to get the Israelis, and thankfully the Israelis didn't get involved because a lot of the coalition partners, I don't know if people know, were Arab nations, Egyptians and Jordanians and things like that. But if Israel had got involved, that would have broken up. So fortunately, the State Department did a great job of convincing the Israelis to stay out of it. Maybe we promised them lots of cool weapons or something. But also some Scuds were sent down to Dhahran in Bahrain. And I remember being in the Sheraton Hotel when the air raid sirens go off. And so we went down to the basement of the hotel, which was what we were supposed to do. And of course, we had our gas masks and things, which we kind of put on. And then civilians down there with nothing. And most of us, we took our gas masks. I don't think we could do it. You couldn't sit there in a gas mask watching us, mainly Arab, Bahraini, rich families who are living there with their kids. Well, so we said, well, if it comes, it comes, Because those Scuds were coming over, if you remember, that became a big part of the coalition effort was to target those Scud launchers. We made a huge efforts to find them. Special forces, SAS guys went in, Strike Eagles were trying to find them and bomb them. And because this was causing us problems, it had potential to break up the coalition. So
it's a terrible weapon, but it's a V2, basically, unguided rocket.
And we were worried about it would have chemical weapons on board.
Bruce, you mentioned luck and timing. I think you had, like you mentioned, the perfect timing. I don't know if luck is the right word, but you got to do the thing you got to do to really employ the airplane.
It was satisfying, I think, to have done it for real. You've taken the taxpayers' money to have a good time, in the RAF flying club that it is in peacetime, and now it's time to see, can I actually do this for real? And that's partly your flying skills, your weaponing skills, but also have you got the stomach for it? We did have. There was a few guys that were sent home in the middle of this. They just freaked out. It's kind of stressful. And
how did you know? Was it something that you had a feeling of calm and you knew I have a job to do? Or was there a moment maybe?
I'm not saying that I found it easy. That's moving. Any time like that in the moving map that the Iraqi border crossed, you're suddenly tense, or maybe it's the wrong word. Focused, absolutely focused. Like when I described in detail how I ran through that first night, absolutely. My body, I'd been training for this for 28 years old. I'd been training for this for 28 years, and I knew exactly what to do with precision, totally focused. And that was the same for all anytime you were in the Badlands, and you didn't really relax. And it was a moment of relief when you saw that border thing crossing on the map display. Whew, right, we're back. We've made it another one. So, you got tense. But on the other hand, I heard one of your other podcast, the guy was saying he came across some guy who'd been to Afghanistan on like 7 tours. This was a short war, so I didn't end up with PTSD out of it. It was short and sharp, and I got home quickly. But on the other hand, I can say that I did the job for real.
Absolutely, indeed. After you got home, what was the next job in line for you?
So I'd been asking for a while to go back to the Tactical Weapons Unit, where they taught the Hawk airplane. They taught the students to fly post wings, how to operate the Hawk, start to learn weapons and tactics. I remember, and the reason I asked for it, because I remember going through the student, looking at the instructor saying, what a great job, Now, it wasn't a great career move. I mean, if you want to get promoted, you wanted to stay where you're already an expert or become a weapons leader or something like that. But I wanted diversity. I wanted to go back to this flying around this little sports car around the sky and having a great time. So I got posted to one of the 2 bases that you could do this thing, very short conversion on the Hawk, back to Hawk, then a course of how to be an instructor, and to teach the various sorties. Initially, I was a tactics instructor, so that meant maybe about 2/3 of the syllabus I could teach, the low levels, some of the BFM, basic fighter maneuvers stuff. About midway through that assignment, I did the weapons instructor course. So now I could, and not everybody, and that was a kind of pat on the back. Not everybody got to do that, but, and then so it was a 4-month-long course specializing in, like a weapons school, all lots of math calculations and all the weapons stuff, and then how to teach all the weapon events, and then back on the instructional squadron teaching them the 5 weapon events we had, which was strafe with the gun on the flag, the air-to-air on the flag, the dive bombing, this level bombing, and then there was one we called Cine, which was just a tracking exercise. Actually, they had the target aircraft would do this like can Wooford-Ill maneuver, and the students had to sit there 200 meters behind, or tracking it, kind of thing, and produce good. It's really an exercise in lead and lag, actually. So I ended up getting a lot out of that tour. I was effectively the weapons and tactics instructor. The other thing that was nice about that is the RAF used to use these Hawks as, I want to say, red air. We would we'd get tasked to take a couple of airplanes up to the Tornado unit to be the aggressors for them, or to be targets for them, intercept targets and stuff. So that, you got a break from instructing. You got to take these airplanes, and that's where the Hawk came out. It was such a versatile airplane. You could get up to 45,000 feet. You could, you could maneuver. It's tightly, in a tight circle, 6, 7, 8G. It was so reliable. It's such a basic airplane, so reliable. NATO used to run a program called TLP, Tactical Leadership Program. It was like a mini red flag kind of thing. And they would have, it was in several locations. When I went there, it was in a base called Florens in Belgium. And there were a couple of F-111s, US guys. Guys would just basically, would fly their airplanes. 2 American F-111s, 2 German F-4s, 2 Dutch F-16s, 2 British Tornadoes, blah, blah. Very small thing. And it was a month-long course, tactical leadership, learning to lead mixed fleet composite formations. Great fun. And I got sent out. I never actually did the course itself, but I got sent to take a couple of Hawks to be red air, So we flew from our base in Shipman. So it was me and it was 2 training squadrons. It was me and one of the other instructor pilots from the squadron. And I had an RAF corporal in my back seat. He had an RAF SAC. It was like a E3 or something like that. For 2 weeks, we were closed in the baggage pod, landed there, flew the airplanes like twice a day for 2 weeks. Didn't take any spare parts with us. The corporal and the SAC did the turnarounds for us, refueled it, flew them back. So Tornado wouldn't last like that. Tornado, we would brief as a 4-ship, because that's what we had for a training mission. Step as a 3, because one's already. Taxi as a 2, and take off as a single ship. That was the normal. It wasn't, it was a hangar queen in a lot of respects. Complex airplane. Every time you came back, you had faults for the maintainers to fix. Hawk, so reliable. We could take it away for 2 weeks, fly 2 flights a day, and take a corporal with you, and he would, whatever came up, we'd fix. Had a good sized internal baggage area. Plus, if we took the gun pod, you could take the back end off and get a big RAF duffel bag in there, not pressurized, of course. And then there was a funny little space at the back, which, for some strange reason, fitted a box of 12 wine bottles. I don't know why they designed that in there, but we put it to test. So you could come back with a case of wine. So the Hawk was a great tour. We got to, I was teaching the students the tactical stuff. These are students who've had their wings already, so you're not teaching them, the basic how to land, instrument flying. You're teaching them
the fun stuff. Yeah.
The maneuvering the airplane and trying to get them into the mindset of, you're a fighter pilot now, not just a pilot. You've got to. It's all about employing your airplane as an effective weapon.
Did you find that folks took to that naturally? That people could kind of turn that switch on and become a warrior, or do some people maybe need a little bit different process?
It's a process. I mean, yeah, but I think, we kind of, by the time they left and they went off to their operational units, I think, they had seen it. And therefore the instructors need to spend time just sitting in the students' crew lounge with them, just telling stories, but not in a kind of superior way like I've perhaps done tonight, but just, treat the students like it's they've made it. They're part of the club, and you're now a fellow RAF pilot with us, and and then they kind of get wrapped up in this whole thing that they realize they belong, and I think that was a big part of it too.
You're training your relief. You're training the people that are going to go out and do the job after you go back to do something else.
And the other thing is, the failure rate wasn't. I mean, by now you've got your selection and aptitude tests. You've got all the basic training. By the time they come to us, they've got a pretty good grasp, and so you weren't having to chop a lot of guys, because that's always very depressing for an instructor to do. Happen occasionally, and you've probably been through it.
It's not a good feeling.
No, but I basically treated these guys as already in the club, and I'm just honing their skills. and they've all got plenty of ability to pass this course if I just make sure I direct it in the right way.
Yeah, it's a challenge for you. That's that's your new very cool.
So I enjoyed, and of course great for my CRM learning to be an instructor.
Tell me some good student stories. I feel like that's always where I learn so much. Always being surprised by what the student either knows or doesn't know in some cases.
I do remember we would, when the syllabus would typically, each phase, say a phase was 5 flights long, you would do a dual, sortie with them in the back seat, and then they would do the rest of the phase solo, and you would be on the wing, right? So they did, therefore, 4/5 of the students' hours during this course would be solo, in fact. So you've got an empty, and they would be allowed to fly solo, no distraction by putting somebody in the trunk there, or in the boot, as we would say in England. But the instructor in the back has an empty back seat a lot of the time. Sometimes we would, some of the navigators who would, your guys would come and spend a couple of months. If they had a couple of months to kill before their operational course was started, they would come and just fly in the back they had no real syllabus to follow, but they were just absorbing what was going on. And once in a while, of course, they're aviators. They've been sort of. But once in a while, I took this airman up one time for an incentive ride, and it was he was throwing up before he'd left the airfield boundary, and I felt so bad because I had a student who'd really prepared long and hard, and I'm sure he was psyched up to do his very best. I didn't feel it was fair on the student in the other airplane to say, sorry, so I just had to say to this poor airman in the back, you're going to have to tough it out. 45 minutes of yanking and banking, and he was just, when we got him out of the airplane in the end, he just couldn't even stand up. He was just, so, I felt that, and I kind of made a comment that wasn't really the right time to do an incentive ride. The better time we did a weather ship in the morning because the British weather is so bad. And before we wanted to know what the weather was like in the low-flying areas, you would get airborne at 7:30, single ship. One instructor would, and then you would fly through the various low-flying areas, get on the radio by 8 o'clock, and then, which was when the squadron was saying, hey, go north or go south, that's where the better weather is. And so that was an idea. We would take a lot of incentive rides on that weather ship because you could be kind of gentle. One other point I wanted to make here is, and it's a complaint, I guess, against the RAF. So the students, and it happened during my time here, I mentioned already, the guys would go through and do about 70 hours on the Hawk at Valley, advanced flying training, get their wings. Then come down to us, do another 70 hours in the same airplane, painted camouflage and grey with weapons on it, strike command philosophy. So the bean counters decided, that's not an efficient way to do it. You're repeating a lot of stuff. They're having to come down and do a local area famil sortie, and then they have to repeat some of the formation things. So they came up. They said, rather than have 2 bases doing different things, we're going to have, we're going to invent this course. And the guys were having 140 hours on the Hawk before they went to their operational types. We're going to have an identical syllabus at each of the 2 bases. It's going to be 100 hours long. And they got their wings at the end of it. So to the bean counter's point of view, I've just saved 40 hours of flight time, and before the guy goes to the operation. In my mind, that's a guy's 40 hours less experience. He's going to have to make that up on the operational conversion unit, which is a much more expensive airplane to fly. But in terms of the bean counters, it looks like they've chopped 40 hours of savings out of the training syllabus. So towards the end of my time there, we went from the 70-hour course to this 100-hour course. And that was all the Hawk time that those guys were getting. So all the phases were trimmed away from 5 flights to 4 or something like that. They trimmed it all down. And actually, to their credit, the students did just fine. They did manage to graduate with just 100 hours, but they're still not as experienced. Now, why do the bean counters they're usually civil servants is who they are, think that this is they don't understand what it really takes to fly an airplane. They think, I can just move the goalposts and it looks like I've saved some money.
Yep. And unfortunately, the phrase normalization of deviance, we use it in aviation all the time, right? Nothing happened, nothing bad happened, or it's not maybe, I don't know, perhaps there's a pretty well-known mishap recently. It was an F-16 at Shaw, and I don't know all the details. It's been all released publicly, or a lot of it has been, but a very young wingman, and somehow a lot of, green or boxes, red boxes were made green, and they sent him to the tanker for the first time at night ever. Because so many things were skipped. Mm-hmm. And again, there's more to it than that. I certainly don't want a bottom line that there's plenty that you can read about online. But yeah, when you push that, putting those first looks at something in a gray airplane where it's going to cost way more. The consequences are going to be way higher. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. So I'm hopeful people, and I appreciate you telling the story, I'm hopeful people can learn from that and realize, we want the cheapest.
I'm not optimistic. They will.
I know. Yes, I understand your pain. I'll tell you a story about that offline that I was dealing with today.
We live in now. Yeah,
I'll try to be the voice of optimism here at the table. I hope I hope we can both learn from that.